I assume nothing's started yet?
Hello?
Hey there, this is Fatima. Can you hear me? You may need to unmute yourself if you're talking.
Hey, Fatima, this is Zach. I can hear you.
Oh, wonderful.
Anything else?
Kirsten, are we good? Okay. Do we have volume there as well?
I just said, can you hear Fatima on here?
Okay. We're setting up.
There won't be.
Otherwise, you can also mute it, whatever works for you.
Okay.
You're breaking up.
Do I open up the presentations here and then this just sits over there and record them? Well, we want to record the talk. And I guess yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay. Yeah. We may need to reposition the table a bit.
Because they don't look. They look at the presentation here. We haven't been here. Oh. Unless it's a PowerPoint. Okay.
But even if it's a PowerPoint, they're able to see it via Zoom on their computer.
Oh, Matt told me to run it on here so that they can see it.
Yeah.
That's what we're thinking. Okay, but these guys don't need it.
No.
We'll see it up there. But we don't need the individual, like, the application. We don't need that. Okay. So do I open up the Google Drive and find, okay. All right, everyone, I think we'll, in the interest of time, we will try get started. We're mostly set up.
Coffee is still brewing, by the way.
Fantastic. That's a bonus. We got a great room and coffee. We can go around and do a quick round of introductions. I know that we are scheduled until 2:30, but I'm going to ask that we try to go faster than we have scheduled. Make sure that we're over to Dublin Crossing in time. The program starts at 2:30, which Senator Friends and Senator Draheim will be speaking at, two of our key Homes for All advocates, and Deidre Schmidt, fellow from Common Bond Communities, will be presenting the Homes for All Champion Awards there. So I'd like to make sure that many of us can be there as possible right at 2:30, or if not earlier. My name is Carrie Johnson. I'm with the Metropolitan Consortium of Community Developers, or MCCD, and very happy to be here in Mankato.
And I'm Fatima Moore with Minnesota.
Hey, the line just got muted for the main room.
So someone's muting us for some reason. Someone's muting us.
All right, now we can hear you.
Unmuted us. I think we muted us.
Shoot, they can hear us. You have to mute it again.
Same time we gotta mute ourselves.
That you just have to go through and mute them.
So microwave,
Or
let us know if you
themselves.
want your lunch microwaves and we can help facilitate that for you.
Folks on Zoom and on the phone, if you could mute yourselves though, until you would like to say something, that would be great. However, maybe we can do a quick round of introductions of people on the phone first. Starting with a number of 6822. Maybe I'll just scroll down. So Valerie Dolson from MNCAP, Ellen Bodler from the ARC. There are a couple numbers that I don't know, which is why too much. Partners for Affordable Housing, Matt Trainer from MCH is on, Tammy Walhoff from Lutheran Advocacy, Zinar from Project for Pride in Living, and the screen went black, and Zach Eichen from the Brain Injury Alliance, and I think I may have missed a few other folks, so feel free to chime in if you would like. You want to introduce yourself?
I'm helping with Zoom.
Do you want to introduce themselves on? Could somebody that is not on mute mute themselves then? Because it's quite loud. They might just be on the phone. All right. We'll let you introduce yourself. Name and organization.
Don McQuarrie with the Wilder Foundation.
Sam, Nami?
Elizabeth Glidden, Minnesota Housing Partnership. Dan Johnson with Habitat Community.
Fisher Vincent.
Hi. The tenant. The tenant. Being an here.
Friends, we've lost the Mankato audio.
Mission is to connect people to historic places, promoting community vitality. And the other thing that we has really led in our mission shift is we are the Minnesota program. Sorry, this is really I don't know why it's coming out. Sure. They don't hear you.
Hello?
Can Mankato hear me? This is Matt. If you can hear me, we can't hear Mankato.
Their finances because they can't claim the credit until the project is done. Usually the way they bring capital to the project is selling these credits to investors who bring money to the project. The investment value of the federal tax credits currently is about 87 to 91 cents per dollar, which is not what it was before. And we're really concerned that if we adopt the same rules that the Minnesota credit is that the federal credit is going to further reduce the pricing, and there's really going to be an evaporation of the market for using these tax credits for any kinds of projects, housing or otherwise. There is no statewide cap or because if you meet the project standards, then you get the credit. It's not like LIHTC or new markets or something where there has to be an allocation process and there's a cap for it. So it's really flexible in that way. Federal tax conformity, though, is still an issue for us beginning after the first of the year and when the legislature reconvenes. We're also concerned about the looming sunset date, which is June 30th of 2021. So this is the year that unless we get the sunset date extended or eliminated, we will start seeing projects not coming forward. The other problem with the state tax credits and the federal credits as well is that they're notoriously difficult to use for smaller projects. As you can imagine, these are really, really complex projects to put together from a financing term in terms of meeting the standards that are imposed on the project. You have to hire a number of consultants, everywhere from a historical consultant to a who does the tax credit application for you, and a CPA who knows what they're doing, and a lawyer who can structure the deals with the investments. And it gets really, really burdensome. And we're finding that people will not use the credits if their project costs are under $7 million. That's still a pretty big project. There's a lot of places that could use this project that are just not going to be met by that reality. So one of the things that we believe really strongly is that historic buildings are assets to communities. They're places that were left to us that if they are maintained and if they're in good condition, they can continue to serve a really viable purpose. It's really wasteful for us not to figure out new ways to use those assets. And there's a lot of things that are vacant and underutilized, especially throughout greater Minnesota. And in particular, we see upper stories of downtown commercial buildings that are vacant. There's a lot of vacant storefronts as well, but in particular, there's a lot of upper stories. And they're usually used for storage or they're just there, vacant and deteriorating. A lot of times, you know, if there's a roof leak or something like that, it's going to take a couple levels for it to filter down until a owner even recognizes that they have a problem, or they'll do all kinds of like catch, intermediary steps like putting a wading pool up on the second story so they can catch the roof drip. Obviously, that is not a long-term solution for any kind of viable reuse for those buildings. And so we're trying to figure out ways to try to get them back into the viable housing stock and help increase the property tax base, but also get those utilized for all kinds of options. We have 39 downtown historic districts already designated throughout Minnesota and outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And there's a number of these that have these conditions where essentially the upper stories are vacant. I've seen them in Crookston and Faribault, Caledonia, Litchfield, Virginia is rampant with underutilized historic buildings in their downtown. So we think that there's a lot of opportunity there. Vacant schools and other light industrial buildings and historic hotels and things like that could also be really excellent candidates for reuse. A classroom building is about the size of a modest apartment, and so it really makes a lot of sense to reuse those. And there have been a lot of examples of historic school buildings already throughout Minnesota that have been reclaimed this way, but there's a lot of school consolidation that's still happening. There's a lot of newly vacant schools that all have the opportunity to be adaptively reused as housing if we can make the numbers work. Some of them are smaller though, and actually some of them also don't meet the National Register criteria. So that's another problem in how we're doing this. One of the personal heartbreak stories for me is to see this historic hotel building in Crookston. It was a very prominent building on the downtown corner in Crookston. Back in 2010, there had been a housing proposal, but the MHFA financing didn't come through, and the city decided to demolish the building rather than sell it to a developer. And this could have been like 60 units of housing. It was a really prime spot and really had a lot of potential, but that building was demolished. So what we're proposing is to add a boost to the historic tax credit for affordable housing, and our hope is that that would then offset some of those additional expenses to do smaller projects. To have an extra 5 or 10% of the QRE costs would help do that, and we could, put any kinds of conditions or qualifiers on that, in terms of location, census tract, inside the metro, outside the metro, number of units that are provided, that kind of thing. All of that, I think, is subject to negotiation and discussion, and I would love to have your feedback on that. Some of the programs that we're familiar with in other states that have state historic tax credits that have an affordable housing, added affordable housing incentive are Maine, Maryland, Connecticut, and Delaware. all East Coast, all New England. I realize that. I don't know if there's similar cases elsewhere, but it has been pretty successful in those states. So from the organizers, we can either like take comments, discussion now, or I can go right on into my next proposal, and then we can kind of discuss them as a pair. What would your preference be?
We've been taking questions for each proposal, so if there are any now, can you also speak up really loudly?
Okay.
A couple of questions. So just in terms of, is this related to tax conformity or not? Would this be something different?
This would be something different and an entirely new proposal. Yeah, not related to tax conformity, but that is still an issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, do you have a sense of, I'm not super familiar with historic tax credits, so how much of the use of the tax credit would go toward housing related projects versus other projects?
I would say so far, so we've had our tax credit since 2010, and there's been about 100 projects. I would say probably 70% of those have been used for some level of housing, either market rate or affordable. There are a few office conversions, and there's been a couple things that have been used, you know, for smaller commercial things, but the vast majority of the projects are used for rental residential. Yeah.
Yeah. So you referenced some examples from other states where this tiering has happened. Can you talk a little bit about what were the results from those states on, you know, how well it was utilized, this incentive or boost, you know, how it worked operationally?
Yeah, and the state I know the best from what I've heard from our peers in other states is Maine. And they've had an affordable housing boost for several years. What's interesting, I think, about Maine compared with Minnesota is Maine is a very rural state, and so they have a lot of small projects. So one, their state tax credit is structured a little bit differently as well. They have to claim their state tax credit over 4 years. It was set up that way, or it's been that way for a long time. So they're all kind of used to that condition of having to parcel that out. But they have used this affordable housing boost, and since they have a lot of smaller buildings in smaller towns, I think they found it to be pretty successful. I don't know number-wise how many they see directed towards projects that do affordable housing versus other, but I could find that out. The Maryland proposal is actually brand new. This is something that they just got signed into law like in May of this last year, so I don't think that there's been any results to point to for that yet, but I can definitely follow up with their directors and talk with them a little bit more about what they see the potential as being. And you know, Maryland is also a big state with many of the same kinds of issues as Minnesota. There's a lot of rural parts of the state that need investment. There's also some urban parts of the state that have seen a lot of disinvestment and how to recover from that. So I think that they're hoping that both of those conditions will be met through that affordable housing. Yeah, Sasha. Sure.
Do you have a revenue estimate on what the request will cost?
I don't. Yeah, no.
Would we be able to potentially have some of that information regarding the historic use of the tax credit available for us to think about as we're putting together?
The historic use of just the tax credit as it is?
Yeah, you said that it's, you know, probably 70% on some mix of housing, but just a little bit more detail on what those numbers have been in recent years.
Yeah, I could go through the data that's available for that and pull it together. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah,
to the extent, you know, I know you were working on some conformity issues last year too. Just wondering what lawmakers, or if any, you talked to about this. I know there was some interest in making some adjustments to conform that historic tax credit to the federal level, and making those adjustments regarding the 5-year versus 1 year. How will that play into this conversation? And if that decides to, if that gains more momentum than this, how are you going to redirect or focus your attention?
I think they could be paired conversations, frankly. I mean, I think in terms of helping our state historic tax credit meet the needs of Minnesotans is a conversation that needs to be happening. And I think, you know, we've seen a lot of those large vacant buildings that were kind of the white elephants in the Twin Cities that were vacant for a long, long time be tackled. The Pillsbury A. Milda Schmidt Brewery, some of the warehouses in North Minneapolis or Northeast area, North Loop. A lot of those things have been addressed really successfully using the tax credit. And I think it's time for us to think about how can we help make this a tool for more of the state to be able to benefit from. And I think that the conformity issue, and you know, part of this is doing some really complicated math that I don't have all of the inputs yet for, but if our state credit is allowed to remain refundable, and then you need to take the federal credit over 5 years, I'm expecting that would allow there to be more access for smaller developers and for smaller projects, because you could use that refund to start paying back your bridge loans or whatever it is you needed to get the project going with. And then you might actually be able to use the 5 years of project, you know, tax credits at the federal level for your, you know, your own development taxes. So in terms of like how this promotes more opportunities, I think if we say, you know, there's this conformity issue, but if it's a refund, then it'll open up more projects. If we have it a boost, it will open up more projects. And I think that those two things could happen simultaneously. You know, our concern is conformity, but it's also like the winds of the legislature are just not going that direction. Our first priority is getting the sunset date extended. So that will be the thing that we will advocate for first and foremost, because all of this is moot if we don't have a sunset, if there's no program in 2 years. So nothing will happen. And then I think, you know, part of it is too where our stakeholders are on this. And if there is a lot of interest throughout Greater Minnesota, if more of the Greater Minnesota housing advocates see that this is an opportunity and are willing to work with us on it, that would absolutely be on the top level of things that we would advocate for. Did I answer your question? Yeah, it is complicated. It's all very, very complicated. So, yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Have you seen any online? Okay. All right.
Yeah, so heading into another complicated issue, another really complicated issue is this old house property tax valuation exclusion, a property tax break for older home rehab. And this is something that I put in as what we've had before in Minnesota, primarily as a way to start conversation, but I know that this old house, as it had worked before, has some problems, and I think it would still have some problems, so I'm really open to hearing ideas and other ways of going about this. But so we had a program in Minnesota called This Old House. It was a property tax valuation exclusion from 1993 to 2003. It was really, really well used. The particulars of the program was that you had to have a minimum qualifying value of $50,000 for houses that are 70 years old or older, or $25,000 for houses, or maximum, sorry, that's the maximum amount of the improvement that you can make for houses that were 45 to 69 years old. If you made an improvement to that, as it had to be at least $5,000 worth of added value to your property as the tax assessor assessed it. So it wasn't that you put $5,000 in, it was if whatever you did to your house improved its value $5,000, then you could take, it would freeze the taxes on that essentially for 10 years. Additions were allowed. The construction of a 1 or 2 car garage was allowed. And so it was used in 86 of Minnesota's 87 counties. There was like $700 million of excluded market value over that 10-year time, spread out over like almost 60,000 projects. So as I said, it was pretty widely used. And Hennepin County was by far the biggest users. You can see 15,000 parcels in Hennepin County as opposed to just 5,000 in Ramsey County and another 4,000 in St. Louis County. But then there was some spread all throughout the state. It's based on the data that was available, it looks like it was initially pretty popular. It had about 651 projects in that very first year because those started phasing out in 2004. But here we are now. It's been 15 years or so since we've had any essential incentive for doing homeowner rehab. I have this map here that shows that most of the projects were pretty modest in size. They ranged from $9,000 to $16,000 in excluded value. So, you know, maybe it was a kitchen renovation, maybe it was a new garage, maybe it was some kind of insulation or other energy improvements household-wide, but it wasn't like everybody was completely gutting and rehabbing their house or only doing pretty modest fixes. So this old house bill has been fairly regularly reintroduced, most recently in 2017. So we know that there's some legislative interest in it. There's been hearings at the Property Taxes Committee, but it has not ever made it out of committee, and part of that is because the tax assessors don't like it. And, you know, I can understand why. It's a little bit extra burdensome. It's another thing to have to administer, but also it's not particularly equitable in terms of its application throughout the state. And I was talking with folks who live in Granite Falls, and they're like, you know, our property taxes are $150 a year. Having some kind of benefit like this would not be an incentive to me doing or not doing a project in Granite Falls. In Winona, taxes on a similar sized house are $1,500 a year, whereas in St. Paul, taxes on that same size house are $3,800 a year. So when you look at what the actual benefit of the tax exclusion and how much that might or might not incentivize rehabilitation, it's not very evenly spaced all across the state. And as I said, the county tax assessors have testified against it. The Department of Revenue has testified against it. This isn't a program that they're particularly fond of. The challenge is, though, that I think that there really needs to be some kind of way to help incentivize rehabilitation of older houses. They're a really viable way to make sure that we have a range of options in all of our communities, and that the housing needs that have been met traditionally over generations can be met through existing homes. There's a lot of other states that have some kind of property tax valuation exclusion or some other way of incentivizing homeowner rehab. A whole list of them here. Wisconsin also has an income tax credit that they allow for historic homes, things that are actually listed in the National Register. This would just be for older homes, though, as a way to incentivize that. Some of the proposals that have been, when it's been reintroduced, it would allow owner-occupied duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes to qualify. And in the previous iteration, when we had this old house in place, it did allow for there to be an improvement, and it would be eligible regardless of what unit was improved. So if it was the homeowner's unit, it would still qualify for that valuation exclusion. If it was one of the tenant units, that would still apply to. And especially when we're looking at larger homes, you know, these are not necessarily viable in the city or in smaller communities, especially as single family homes, but they can be really viable as duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, or more. These are two houses, actually both of them in Winona. The one on the top left is as a triplex now. I think one of the units is in the carriage house, and then the house has been divided into two very large duplex units. And then the house on the right is actually a fourplex. And part of the challenge too is that houses need to be maintained. They fail really rapidly when they're not maintained. As I was walking around Winona the other day, I noticed like evident signs of building deterioration on an alarming number of older houses in the downtown. I don't think that we as a society and we as an economy can afford to replace those structures with new. It would be really, really costly and really, really time consuming and a huge waste of resources, but we can find ways to incentivize rehabilitation and maintenance of houses of this era so that we can keep those as viable buildings in our housing portfolio, so to speak. That said, this old house has are you giving me the high sign? It's time to wrap up. Okay, so this is it's a problematic mechanism though, and there's a lot of other ways that we could think about it, or ways to try to prioritize it. I'm open to hearing your suggestions and your ideas on that, if you have them. I think that if we but there should be some way of trying to get this into the mix. You know, we really believe that rehabilitation of commercial properties, of multifamily properties, of single-family homes, reclaiming those vacant and underutilized buildings and getting them back into the mix would be a really good way to stabilize neighborhoods and stabilize the housing stock. So that's that. Yes, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I mean, I know this was a very popular program, but especially, I do think it has a lot of design challenges. So I'll just identify some from my personal perspective. This isn't an organizational position, but one is there's no tie to, you know, the income. So what is your personal ability to make those repairs? As it's designed right now, you know, you can essentially be someone who has a property in a strong market,
right,
and you're getting a benefit against the strong market. I think another just issue, again, if this is a statewide program, is how this plays into concerns around displacement and gentrification in majority community color neighborhoods, or other issues like that. And then finally, it's not tied to any affordability. And I don't know if there's a way to design it that could be something, how that would happen, because of course it's a homeownership opportunity, it's not a rental opportunity. And so, so anyway, so you have this asset, you're putting public dollars into the asset, and you're reducing then the cost of the asset, while the gains are still going directly to whoever's that property owner still.
Yep. Yep. I understand that there are a lot of things that are flawed about it, and I don't know, frankly, how to address those or how to prioritize those. But I guess the essential point that we come back to is that there are single-family homes in all markets that need to be rehabilitated, and there's going to be barriers to accessing any kind of money to getting those done. And even if you like, and we hear about it too, because people are like, well, older homes are so energy inefficient. They're really energy inefficient when they're not maintained well. When the furnace has not been upgraded in 40 years, they're going to be energy inefficient. But if people can't qualify for a mortgage that includes the cost of rehabilitation on top of the cost of purchasing the house, and in a distressed market, that's an additional barrier to homeownership, I think. Then how else do we find ways of tackling that conundrum, and then also keeping these houses as viable options for the long term? I mean, I'm starting to look 20 or 30 years. Some of the houses that I saw in Winona are not going to be standing in 20 years if they're maintained at the level that they are now. They just won't. And then we have a whole bunch of additionally displaced people because there literally won't be housing there, or the conditions that they're living in will get to the point where they have to be shuttered and removed. So I don't necessarily have the answers, obviously, but I'm open to, I would like to further the conversation, I guess.
There was a comment online too, similar along those lines of like, how does this benefit, you know, people struggling to find housing too? So
yeah.
I think that answer kind of gives that a little bit of both. But
yeah, and similar question. So perhaps as a community, we partner with families between 30 and 80% AMI. Mm-hmm. We have two programs, one called the Brush with Kindness that purchases homes in cash, and a new one called Aging in Place for seniors. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if there might be a way, maybe to have offline, that there's a way that this could be useful in a new program that we're developing. Right? Because the way I understand it, it wouldn't work before the developer, right? So yes, helping seniors trying to think.
Yeah, and I mean, and there are some programs in other states where they have allowed developers to use the credits, and then it would have to be for a qualifying home buyer, though, too. So that's another way to try to get that initial, like the developers don't get to claim any kind of tax benefit on it, but the homeowner who buys it under income qualifications would, and then they would see that property tax hold for whatever the duration. Yeah. So good. All right. Thank you. All right. Thanks.
Sorry, Erin, we do have a question. Someone has asked that their question be read out loud to open it. and that question is, how does the house tax credit link to housing and homelessness, which again was already stated, but because they're not in the room, we wanted to provide a chance to read it out for them, as well as once a tax credit is in place, how does a homeless person get a home, and how many or what percentage of them will benefit. So just a question to keep in mind as perhaps we are considering all of this. Okay. Any more questions or comments?
That's where you can use this little form too, because we have to get moving along. Thank you.
So next we have
the Corporation for
Amy.
Amy.
Yes. I'm wondering, could we start with HMIS? That would be great. And also I wanted to just let the room give you a little heads up that we did hear a proposal of the FHPP already, so you can kind of do a briefer overview. Okay, perfect. Who did you hear that from? I will look it up and match my. Oh, awesome. Perfect. Yeah. Anybody need one of these?
So we're obviously having some technical difficulties with technology today, and if you are an HP user, I welcome your help. I know, HP, well, here we go again, HP user. We need to take this off sleep. We think it continues going off because it's on sleep mode. So what was next exercise? Settings, click system, color, and then sleep, and then you should be able to adjust it. Power and sleep.
Okay, yes. So I just wanted to give you. Yeah, thank you. It was okay to. Yeah. Yeah. I just wanted to make because I was like,
Amy, your proposal is specifically on risk mitigation, right?
Yeah, that's the difference. And I know there's somebody else. It is different. I was going to say it's not about FHPAP in totality. It's risk mitigation.
Where are they talking about?
Yeah, so that's too. I was trying to look at the list here.
Oh, is it NAMI? Okay.
There's section 55.
I don't remember if it was NAMI or somebody else. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Good.
Prosperity's front door, we gotta make it happen.
Okay, I think Jane Lawrence is
Are you the new campaign manager?
Maybe. If our technology is working today. It's okay if it's not.
Here, I'm gonna give you here's the number. Call in here, and then maybe we can unmute herself. So that's the number. And then that's the ID.
It would be a fun, like, fake Twitter account to start.
My name is Karen.
Were you gonna? So hard to stay out of trouble.
Or stand right there.
Whichever field, whatever you want.
Pretty good.
Suggested to Governor Dayton, he loves Twitter, and, give him a chance to influence the process.
And then have them rather than be a backdoor. To the next slide.
And so, the slides in your Google Drive for the next presentation, they're going to start with the HMIS proposal first, which is actually number 4.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's
So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your organization?
Sorry. Getting here. Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Stutzel. I am the Upper Midwest Director for the Corporation for Supportive Housing. So I just started in June. I know a lot of you and have been here before as a member of the the Office of Prevention and Homelessness at the state for the State Interagency Council on Homelessness. So I'm thrilled to be here with Dimitri and some other folks who are going to hopefully join us on the phone to talk to you all today about 2 proposals we're putting forward. One on HMIS and another one about a risk mitigation fund opportunity through FHPAP. So we'll talk about that one second. But thank you all.
Good morning again. My name is Dimitri Vinca. I am the project director for HMIS here in Minnesota. And HMIS, next slide please, is the Homeless Management Information System. HMIS is a tool that is used by over 200 nonprofit agencies around the state and over 1,000 users to capture trends and outcomes for over 20,000 homeless beds statewide. Those beds really span the continuum of homeless services from emergency shelter to permanent supportive housing. For the people served by those programs, HMIS captures basic demographics and needs, as well as program participation and outcome data. HMIS tells you where someone goes when they leave a program, and it can tell you if they return to homelessness later. HMIS is the system of record for homeless programs in Minnesota, helping our communities bring in over $30 million in federal funding annually. We use HMIS data to produce information for the point in time count, as well as for measures of system performance, such as how long a person experiences homelessness within a community. These data are being used at several levels to monitor and improve state and local efforts on homelessness, including as a part of the statewide Heading Home Together plan. As such, HMIS provides arguably the single best opportunity to see the collective impact of our statewide efforts to prevent and end homelessness. We also use HMIS to facilitate and gain insights into coordinated entry, the process each community uses to prioritize and place folks into housing. Increasingly, we're also using HMIS to help folks gain access to shelter and services in other ways, something I'll touch on more in a couple of minutes. Since June of 2016, Minnesota's HMIS has been operated by the Institute for Community Alliances, the organization I represent. We're a nonprofit that has been helping other nonprofits in the public sector with data management for over 25 years. We specialize in HMIS, doing this work in 11 states. In Minnesota, we also have a strong multi-sector HMIS governing board that, among other things, is charged with fundraising, ensuring that resources are used transparently and in alignment with stakeholder priorities, and setting HMIS policies to, among other things, protect individuals' data privacy. Fundraising has been a challenge in the past. Jane Lorenz from DHS, one of our board members, is on the phone, and we will unmute Jane here to give her an opportunity to speak on some of the challenges. Jane, can you try speaking now?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, sweet.
Hello?
That worked well.
Okay, good. So I've been involved with HMIS since the early 2000s when HUD put this forth as actually Congress put this forth as an unfunded mandate. And at that time, the state economy wasn't in the best of shape. And the only way to figure out funding of this, we kind of split it three ways. We split it with HUD dollars, hopefully state dollars, and then user fees. And over the years, the user fees and the HUD dollars have kept pace with the cost, but the state money has always been kind of a putting out our hat at certain times of the year, hoping we can get money from different pots, usually leftover money. But there's never been anything stable or secure, which makes budgeting and planning very, very difficult. This year we had hoped there'd be a joint proposal going into the legislature from the commissioner from Minnesota Housing and the commissioner from DHS. Unfortunately, with the election and all the change that's going to happen, that hasn't occurred like we'd hoped it would. And we are coming to you folks as hopefully bringing this forward through Homes for All, and that this would be a way to get some stable state funding as a general appropriation line item in the budget going forward. So that's what we're kind of hoping for today, because we just haven't been able to successfully get a stable source of funding from the state. And we've tried.
Great, thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Jane. And we'll get, Amy will touch more on the ask in a couple of minutes here. Wanted to turn to just a couple examples of how we're using HMIS to help us target investments and actually to hopefully impact the lives of folks we're serving. So I'll be fairly brief with this. One of the things we can do, in addition to looking at program level outcomes and system level outcomes, is look at homelessness and how it intersects with other systems more upstream. An example of this has to do with corrections. So we can, whereas in the past we've been forced to more or less speculate as to the extent of homelessness among the correctional population, we can actually use data matching with HMIS and correctional data to start to really understand that problem from a data-informed perspective. And where we're hoping to go with this actually, and this could apply to corrections or any, really a number of other systems, is we can use this for discharge planning even. So if we can identify the risk factors that might predispose someone, say, to exit foster care and become homeless later on, we can better target resources to those folks. And having these data, again, from such a broad swath of the programs in Minnesota really allows us to do more in terms of how we approach these issues. So,
great.
And then finally, just a quick example of one way, again, getting at real life impact. The Adult Shelter Connect is really a collaborative effort within Hennepin County. All of the single adult shelters are using HMIS to actually give folks access to shelter. Previously, there was really a daily upheaval in people's lives. Even if you got a shelter bed, you're out in the morning and you had to try again in the afternoon or the evening. And using this system, they can reserve the bed for that evening and have even a little bit of stability. And that central office is able to print out kind of community cards, as they're known. Those are now increasingly being used for a number of other things, including the post office, for example, will allow you to use that as a valid form of identification. And through this system, we've seen over 300,000 shelter beds reserved for over 11,000 unique individuals. And really just lifting this example up as a way that HMIS can help kind of amplify systems change efforts around the state. So a lot of different things we're doing with HMIS, and I know it's kind of a broad ask, but really we're about, or this ask, I should say, is about funding that basic infrastructure, and that's what Amy can talk to us about.
Yeah, thank you, Dimitri. So that is what we're asking for. This proposed ask is really asking to fund the basic infrastructure of HMIS, which will result in, as Dimitri has noted, improved targeting of current resources, better collaboration amongst our partners and services across the state, and then really truly maintaining and hopefully increasing that $30 million of federal funding that we draw down from every year to increase housing stability for all Minnesotans. So the cost we're asking for this proposal is $1.5 million to fund that basic infrastructure, and that would be split probably proportionally, or could be split proportionally between the Department of Human Services and Minnesota Housing. And then who will this funding impact? I mean, really, there's a broad swath of folks this is going to impact, but first and foremost, it's Minnesotans who are at risk of or currently experiencing homelessness. As Dimitri showed in his examples, that's improved access to services. Our providers, it's easier, it's increased collaboration, it's a good way to show what you're doing on the ground to all of your funders in philanthropy or at the local level, local government level. At the state, it's really showing our legislature what we're doing with the funds that they appropriate to us and able to show them that in a really strong way. And then for all Minnesotans, it's really healthier and stronger communities for all. So in the grand scheme of the state budget, we feel like this is a pretty modest investment that will help us ensure better use of current state and federal dollars. So I hope you consider it. Thank you.
Right, question. So I know that HMIS has relatively recently been transferred responsibilities and infrastructure to your organization. In the past, it was operated by the Wilder Foundation. This basic infrastructure requested $1.5 million. Where has that funding, is it coming from the same sources? Is it increased?
It's a little bit of both. As Jane alluded to, the state has really used a kind of a pass the hat approach to come up with their contribution. And that to date has not necessarily been the most effective. So the governing board of HMIS has come up with a funding model that essentially is asking the state and the continuums of care to fund at equal levels. The state hasn't quite gotten there yet at this point, so it would be increasing the state amount and making it a more sustainable source of that funding, so that, again, we can be a little bit more sustainable in terms of the budget, and it's not a yearly question about how much can the state contribute and where does that come from.
And could you repeat that question for folks on the phone?
Yes, I guess, and send it please.
Or if you want to be louder, yeah.
It's probably easier, please.
The question was essentially, is this new funding or increased funding or some mix of both?
Perfect, thank you. I have a question about the funding too. Is this, like, if you did not get 1.5 million, is it sort of like useless, it's not enough to do what needs to be done, or is it scalable, and then also is it multi-year or just one time and then good to go? I'm just not understanding.
That's great. So
could you repeat the question?
The question, I guess, was a two-part question. Is it kind of 1.5 million or nothing, or is it scalable somewhere in between? And then is it a one-time ask or more sustainable? Is that?
Do you need more than 1.5 to really do what you need?
Sure. Great question. So the answer to part A is no, it wouldn't be necessarily be 1.5 million. The state contributes about, or the goal for the state is about 850,000 annually. So obviously the 1.5 would be over the 2-year biennium. And if it was a portion of that was legislatively allocated, that would still help give some element of stability. Ideally, this would be an ongoing funding source. So yeah, that really would be that'd be ideal, but anything would help. Yes. Thanks.
I have 2 questions. The first one is, so I know that your organization runs HMIS in like many states, and I just wonder, like, over your operation of these types of systems, what types of improvements have you been making over time in terms of like tracking data, and is there any engagement of directly affected populations in determining what type of data is valuable? And I think the second question after.
Great. I assume folks on the phone heard that, so I won't restate that. So sorts of improvements we've made really is a number of things. So data quality we've seen, which is mainly measured as kind of data completeness. We've seen that increase from about 92% statewide to about 98%. We've seen bed coverage, so the percentage of homeless beds participating in the system, that has also increased about 8.5 percentage points from 17 to 18. We've seen satisfaction increase with the system. Those are the main kind of structural things that have improved in the last couple of years. In addition, we have actually the governing board has done now 2 focus groups with individuals served and trying to gain their impact, their input rather. That can be somewhat of a challenge, to be honest, given that the system has so many kind of funder-imposed requirements. But we've seen at least that with the implementation of statewide data sharing, that folks are able to tell their story fewer times, whereas previously every individual agency would ask the same set of questions because there wasn't any sharing of information between systems.
I can hold my second question right at first.
There's a question here, and then a question. Carrie, you have your hand up.
Oh, I can write it down.
Okay.
Why don't you go that, and then we'll wait in this one. Okay. Read the one.
Sorry. I understand your data will improve access to homeless services. Sounds great. However, I'd also like to see the data be used, not just for linking more services and shelters with the homeless, but to address homeless directly as a way for that to be provided with actual homes. How might your data do this?
Great question. I think one thing I'll note first is we don't necessarily have direct access to those resources ourselves. So it really is, it works through our partner agencies, those 200 funded entities. I guess the closest thing I might say to that is I alluded to coordinated entry earlier. So communities increasingly are coming up with really intentional and prioritized means of accessing housing, and that really relies on HMIS data and reporting to facilitate that process. So I would love to be able to even more directly tie folks to those resources, but it really does work through those partner agencies.
All right, one last quick question. Oh, hi. Yeah, I didn't really catch what the impediment was to having, was it a privacy question? To having people that self-impacted on your board?
That actually has not, there's no real impediment to doing so. That would be great. We do have an at-large position on the board currently. And I think so long as we could figure out a way to make sure that we're being flexible and really creating an opportunity for folks to be able to consistently contribute, I think that would be a great idea.
I think what he was speaking to before was that you had brought focus groups together of people who are experiencing homelessness currently, and they had identified the fact that they keep telling their story over and over again. And so Dimitri was able.
Very traumatic. I
Yes.
agree with you. But my question is, you're receiving federal funding to do with homelessness. Aren't you not required federally to have persons themselves impacted on your board as a permanent position, not a visitor, not a panelist, not a focus group?
So our organizational board, so ICA's board, we do have that representation. This is so this is not a nonprofit board in that sense. It's more of a community oversight body. But that's a point very well taken that that representation should be heard even more so.
I think any impediment to that should be solved.
Agreed. We do even have some, and I certainly don't have the control over any of that. I report to that group, but we do even have some resources in the budget now for engagement of folks served with lived experience, I should say. So we can probably escalate that as we move forward.
Fantastic. All right, is there any other questions? Looks like Nick wants to work with you on this, so, but we can connect you later. And now we can move on to the second presentation.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Do you guys mind if I stand?
No,
Okay.
Stand on the other side.
Yes.
So we can get here. And can you say next to me when you want me to go to the next slide?
Yes, I will do my best to do that.
Or I'll just watch you move your papers.
Okay. All right. Okay, thanks everybody. So this is our proposal around a landlord risk mitigation fund. So really, we're putting forward a proposal that would increase funding to the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, otherwise known as FHPAP, that is going to be specifically targeted to bringing the current landlord risk mitigation fund pilots that the state of Minnesota is implementing to scale across the rest of the state. So I'm guessing most of you in the room know what landlord risk mitigation fund pilots are, but essentially they're insurance for a landlord, protecting them against what many perceive as the additional risk of renting to someone who has a lot of evictions on their record, might have criminal history, potentially even who is low income. And these funds pay for damaged property, non-payment of rent, and other things along that line that aren't covered by a security deposit. The reality is that very often these funds go unused. What we've seen across the nation is that it really truly is insurance for landlords. Go to the next one. So I wanted to give you a sense of scope of what we're looking at in the state of Minnesota. So these next few slides are from Minnesota Housing, their Key Trends in Housing report. So what you can see here is that the blue line is home ownership across the state of Minnesota, and that is substantially declining, while the green bars represent number of renters, and those are growing across the state of Minnesota. So people are choosing to rent or own either as a matter of preference or a matter of necessity, and that's what's really driving the trends that we're seeing across the state in the housing market. And one of those trends next is our vacancy rates. These show the vacancy rates and average rent for two-bedroom households over different areas of the state, including the whole state vacancy rate at the bottom here. And while any vacancy rate below 5% is really going to drive up costs, and that's what we see. And I wanted to make a note here. For many of us, I think we always talk about the vacancy rate being about 2% in the metro, or 2.5. this information was taken from a new data source that Minnesota Housing has at their fingertips that incorporates a lot more units across the state. So there's just a lot more units essentially to be looking at for the numbers and have the base. So that's why you see it being a little bit higher than 2%. At the end of the day, it's still having the same effect that we're seeing is essentially that there's not a lot of access to units, and the units that are able to access that rent is really, really high. I know you guys are doing the same. Go to the next one. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, a trend that we're seeing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about here because I want you to all know where this idea came out of and why we're proposing this risk mitigation fund, is this is actually Metro HRA, so the Met Council's HRA. This is their voucher turnback rate. So essentially, this is their voucher success rate. So in 2016, Metro HRA had 61% of their vouchers were able to be linked up or leased up with a house. That meant that 40% were unsuccessful. This is literally money that's being left on the table with current housing resources because people aren't able to use their vouchers to get into housing, whether that's because landlords won't accept them, a whole variety of reasons. But from talking to housing authorities, especially across the metro, this is what we're hearing, is that they're struggling with getting these vouchers used because landlords can choose who they want. They've got different options. They don't need to work with folks who have a voucher. So something that at CSH, we're working with Hennepin County and Minneapolis Public Housing Authority around getting child welfare involved families into housing before they become homeless, so someone who's at risk of housing. And in those conversations with Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, we started talking to them about FUP vouchers, which are Family Unification Program vouchers, because that's our main tool of working with these child welfare involved families and getting them into stable housing so they can stay together as a family unit. And Minneapolis said to us, you know, we're struggling with utilization, with getting those vouchers utilized. And so it made me curious, and I called all the other metro housing authorities, and none of them were able to fully utilize their Family Unification Program vouchers. So in the state of Minnesota, we have 371 current FUP vouchers in play. These are all the housing authorities and the number of vouchers they've got. The only one I don't know about is Olmsted County. They've got 2 FUP vouchers, but the rest of them were not able to meet their utilization requirements, which is a problem because right now the federal government has $30 million of new FUP money that they're allocating. And if we don't meet the utilization requirements, we can't apply for more. So the first round of funding was at the end of July. So no one in our state who currently has FUP was able to apply for more. Some folks, St. Louis Park, I know, did apply for new, but we really feel like, again, this is a place where we could plug in and work with these housing authorities so that they can increase their utilization rates, getting more families into housing, and then apply for more vouchers for the next round of funding. So this is, we've had actually 2 meetings now with housing, it's a group of metro area housing authorities, social service providers, and then county to talk about this very issue. We see the opportunity of, there's vouchers going unused, that's money on the table of current resources that aren't being used. So the idea is to convene everyone and come up with some really concrete action steps that we can all do as a group to get to the goal of housing more people with current vouchers and then requesting more from the federal government. And so as we had the conversation with everybody about what are the things, what is the toolbox that we can use to get to the goal, risk mitigation fund, landlord risk mitigation fund came up as a really strong, like we've got to engage landlords in a new way that, or increase our landlord engagement in current ways that we're doing at the state to really incentivize them to be renting to people that we work with. So one of the organizations that is part of that group that CSH brought together is Guild, who is in Dakota County but works with Dakota and Ramsey County, and they've been doing a lot of research over the past few years about landlord engagement. And so they did a survey of all property owners and property managers in the area. I think it was about 1,700 people who were surveyed, and these are the reasons, you know, and we all know these of why people are denied rental applications, whether it's felony background, poor references, failure to meet income guidelines, unsatisfactory credit check. I thought the unsatisfactory personal interview was interesting. But the other thing they said, and you can hit the next slide, is that all of those things can be mitigated with either a third-party fund being used or ongoing housing support. Those were the two highest ones. And I think all of us in the room know that when we talk to landlords, they say, I want one person who I can contact, who's my go-to when it all goes down, and if I need help with working with families or individuals. And the other thing is this insurance piece, this business piece, essentially, to make sure that their investments are good. And again, what Guild found is that, just what I said, landlords value that consistent communication, and they're also open to creative and mutually beneficial projects. So they're willing to work with us on this. So here's a proposed ask. It's to increase the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, which is a mouthful, so the FHPAP program, that would specifically target bringing the current landlord risk mitigation pilots that the state has to scale. And so FHPAP funds, I'm going to tell you a little bit about FHPAP. This is one slide, it's real quick. Funds counties, tribal nations, and nonprofits. It's focused on preventing homelessness for those at 200% or below poverty and who are homeless or at imminent risk of becoming homeless. It's the only purely homeless prevention money allocated by the state of Minnesota, and it's a pretty flexible use of funds. So the current pilot that I'm proposing to bring to scale, we got $250,000 at the last session, and then Minnesota Housing kicked in another $100,000 to make it a full $350,000. And it reimburses landlords for any costs associated with, damages to the unit, anything that's not covered by security deposits. And right now, this pilot's being operated in 3 different areas of the state: St. Louis County, which is working with people with criminal history, Brainerd and LSS and Brainerd, which is working with all these counties listed here. And that's really focused on people who have eviction records, and also just multiple barriers to housing, including criminal history, but not solely focused like St. Louis County is. And then the SMAC, Scott Carver on behalf of SMAC, is really focused on youth, getting youth into housing. So these are the 3 regions where the pilot's currently happening. And it took a while for everybody to get this pilot going, but the data right now is that 32 households have utilized the fund, and so far no claims have been made to this insurance fund or this mitigation pilot or mitigation fund, which we know is truly what we see across the nation with these funds. And again, since it's embedded in FHPAP, this prevention program, this mitigation fund would only fund those families who are also receiving services from FHPAP. So my proposal is to increase FHPAP by $2 million, and Minnesota Housing would be who this would go under. And then the proposed benefits really of this is that it leverages and maximizes our current housing resources. It builds, quote unquote, a larger group of housing stock without actually having to build new. It's giving us access to stuff that's already available in the market. It prevents leaving money on the table, like the voucher issues, and ensures we can apply for more federal housing vouchers in the future. And then both the state plan and the governor's task force plan support incentivizing the private market to rent to folks who have barriers to accessing housing. So that's my presentation on that. Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been following this on the Risk Mitigation Fund, and I'm also familiar that in other locations, it's sort of one of these things that is perceived insurance as opposed to being actually utilized, once it's in place. And it may be just too soon to know results from a pilot, but I'm curious. So the intention really isn't to create a risk mitigation fund. The intention is that you're increasing you're increasing placement of voucher rates and numbers of landlords that are accepting vouchers. And so how do we know like what those results were like in the pilot areas, and how are you targeting, again, because the goal isn't actually the risk mitigation fund. We know it's not actually utilized in other locations. And we did this in Minneapolis when I was in Minneapolis, and, you know, or proposed it, and so I understand the, you know, the way you're trying to sense the market.
Yeah.
But, you know, again, the intention are some other things.
Well, I think the intention is that landlords throughout the state see this as a thing they can access and see it as insurance coverage for them throughout the state. So it does free them up to say like, yeah, I will take that Section 8 voucher. Because I believe the Minneapolis, I mean, you know this better than me.
But again, the intention is to increase the voucher placement rate for increased landlords that are accepting vouchers.
Right.
Without a,
Right.
Yeah. So do we know if that's been happening in the pilot area?
And I don't, that's a great question. I don't know it'd be really interesting to see if they're tracking even what the voucher uptick.
Right, I mean, because again, there's like an intention to this program, which is more than just providing comfort to the landlord.
Oh, absolutely.
Like
oh, yeah.
Can you speak up, member?
So I work at Cover County CDA, and we're part of MAC. And I think that we have seen an uptick in folks with barriers that otherwise would not be able to be housed. And so we're doing landlord engagement right now, and we've been letting Jen Romero from Cover County talk at the beginning of all of our presentations, and landlords are actually very intrigued and generally have a lot of questions about the program. So, I mean, from our standpoint, I think it's been successful to households with barriers.
Do you know in particular, because we know that 32 households with barriers have already received. I wonder, do you guys know at all or are tracking if any of those households also have a voucher? And
they all have some type of.
Okay, perfect.
I mean, I don't, the ones that I've come in contact with, but I suspect that Jen
would know all that.
Know that if you want me to connect you with her.
Yeah, I know Jen. Thank you. Perfect.
We have another question, this one from online, and Minnesota NARO supports Landlord Risk Mitigation Fund as an important tool to attract landlords with the vouchers. Does the funding have to be linked to FHPAP?
You know what? That's a great question, and I'm totally open to it not being. I think just because right now that's where the Risk Mitigation Fund pilot lives, and I don't know how difficult it would be to de-link that. I don't even know if that would be an issue. So as far as I'm concerned, no, it doesn't have to be linked to FHPAP.
Yeah, so, you know, you showed in the pilot that there are places that are using it, but no claims have been made. So I'm wondering what happens to those funds after they're not claimed. And I think that's built on Elizabeth's question. And I'm just wondering if this is something where it could be more explicitly detailed as an allowable use, but I'm just wondering if we direct, you know, $2 million by NM at this, but it's underutilized as a fund, are we not maximizing the resources overall, having it as something that, you know, CDAs and HRAs are able to point to as something that's available, but
Well, and that's a great question about, and I know I've started the conversation with folks at Minnesota Housing about, and I think they've figured that out with the pilot. Like, what are we going to do with this money once it's not claimed? And so I can reach out to them and see what those details are. I also will let you know the $2 million, I'm just going to put all the cards on the table. I essentially was like, okay, we got $300,000 that's in the pilot right now, and it's in 3 regions. So I was just like, if we take this statewide, it was just a basic back of the napkin multiplying. So I think there could be a lot more research done about what is the price point of what that fund really needs to be.
And then is the intention that this is sort of a revolving fund, so that you have the $2 million to kind of seed it, but there is a thought at kind of, I don't know, how does that operate?
When you say revolving fund, what do you mean?
Well, I guess maybe it's not revolving if nothing ever goes out. Well, I'm just trying to think of like what ends up being that.
What sustains it?
Yeah.
Yeah, these are all great questions about what, you know, like who holds it and what keeps it kind of at the level it needs to be. And how that, like if stuff comes out, how does that get re-upped to the number it needs to be? Is that what you're
Yep,
asking?
I guess
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is I think there are other benefits to it, but it's not really being sold that way. Like my understanding is that this used to be a part of actually just a Section 8 program. The federal government used to have a very similar program to this. And the other thing is, you know, what's the benefit to residents who are otherwise kind of destitute that they don't have, you know, claim that, you know, for other people it's not such a big deal if, you know, something happens to your unit,
right?
You know, but sort of the backstop is a benefit to residents. Yeah. So.
And something I've heard too, and I think this goes to what you're speaking to as well, is that this needs to be, I think I don't want it just to be the only thing that we do as far as the risk mitigation fund pilot also needs to be connected to getting people connected to services, or somehow it's part of the bigger kind of toolbox where it's a contact with the landlord, connections to services, and having these monies be used as insurance as well. Kind of a bigger story.
All right, last call for questions, quickly.
Hi, I live in southeast Minnesota now,
yes.
And they accept both the Section 8 voucher and the site-based Section 8 basis in the same buildings where they can be torn down. A lot of the buildings are tiny, they're not used, they'll be torn down.
Right.
And I'm just curious why people, if there's a way you could even buy a home southeast on Section 8 voucher. So I'm just curious why those kinds of conversations are going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. That's a great question though.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
They want the voucher done.
Right.
Anxious.
Right. And just getting it down there. Right. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
All right.
Sam, you're next with NAMI. And Sam has 3 proposals that he finished one, but at least 2 of them are, we heard last year, and we're on our legislative. Hopefully some of them are relatively similar.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Sam Smith and I'm with NAMI Minnesota. That's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We are a national organization. I represent the Minnesota chapter. And one of the issues that we consistently hear from our grassroots members are the lack of housing options, including housing options with services for people with mental illnesses. And so we very much appreciate working with this group across the entire continuum of care to meet this need in the metro and in greater Minnesota. And so given the time constraints we're facing and the familiarity of what I'm proposing, I'm going to be brief. But what the first thing I'll talk about is our permanent supportive housing proposal. What is permanent supportive housing? It can be offered either as on a scattered site or site-based model that includes connecting someone with housing and the associated services that can allow the individual to have a successful housing placement. This can include skills building, crisis intervention, outreach, and engagement, and connection with other services as necessary. And our proposal would be grant funding through the HSASME fund, or housing supports for people with serious mental illness. And so there are a number of cost savings associated with permanent supportive housing. In a RAND report from 2017, we came across folks in New York State seeing a 23 to 29% decrease in hospital stays and a 24 to 33% decrease in emergency room visits compared to the control group for individuals accessing permanent supportive housing. These cost savings and the associated health benefits for the individuals increase for what I'll call high utilizers of services. This will include people with a substance use disorder or a mental illness. Other chronic health conditions see these cost increases increase even more so. And so essentially, we know that permanent supportive housing works. not just for people experiencing homelessness, but people with mental illnesses stepping down from a state hospital like the Anoka Metro Regional Treatment Center, leaving a correctional setting. And so these things work. What have we done recently? In 2017, we had a one-time appropriation of $575,000 per year in the biennium. And then in 2018, we saw a $30 million in bonding dollars for permanent supportive housing. That bonding can be used for the bricks and mortar, of course, and not for the actual services associated with supportive housing. And so our proposal, we don't have a number yet because that will depend in large part on who our next governor is and what the budget forecast is, but similar to last year with the hope of a $2 million increase built into the budget. And so that's the supportive housing proposal. Are there any questions on that?
Any questions?
Great. And so another proposal, this is again from last year, is the Bridges Housing Fund. As we all know, the wait list to get a Section 8 voucher can be exceedingly long, and the Bridges program, as the name suggests, is a bridge for people with a serious mental illness to get housing support until they get the Section 8 voucher. And so this has been a very successful program connecting people with mental illnesses with housing while they wait for a longer term solution through the Section 8 voucher. This was in our proposal last year. We'd be seeking a similar increase, again, depending upon the political climate, of approximately $2 million built into the budget. And any questions on that?
Clarification, building budget base funding?
Yeah.
Increase in base.
Mm-hmm. But again, flexible on those numbers. And then our last proposal, which is new for us, is the Landlord Risk Mitigation Fund. I feel like we've already discussed that in some depth, but just to reiterate, one of the interesting questions about it is that you have these funds and the funding isn't being utilized. And so coming to an understanding of what is an appropriate amount for the insurance pool, and then I don't know if we necessarily need to be adding to it year after year after year, as we saw with the Healthcare Access Fund. When you overload it, it becomes tempting to use it for other purposes or legislative goals, which I don't think is something we are interested in doing. And so, again, we'll decide what that number is and then go from there. But any questions there?
I have a question. That's the last one. What is funding the pilot right now? Is it through FHCC?
Yeah.
It is, okay.
And I guess just a clarifying question, was that something that was like a one-time rider pilot appropriation?
Yeah. And I definitely share your concerns about ensuring that this program is effective, because $2 million is a lot of money and could be used in other ways. And so perhaps including some kind of reporting or data requirements and using the funds could be a way for us to determine whether this is actually the best way for us to use our resources. Could be an option.
Just curious, and I was going to ask this before, but now I have maybe a minute. I'm wondering if there's a way that the account could be set in an interest-bearing account or something, so that if it's not accessed, it is still gaining interest and increasing dollars. I don't know.
So just, maybe you can refresh me on kind of what was the impetus for the risk mitigation fund. I'm just going back and trying to draw from memory, when Oregon did it, I think, or state of Washington, or one of those two. They kind of paired it with something else that was happening. So there was a policy piece that was saying, essentially kind of asking landlords to do X or Y. And then this was sort of a pairing to that, to say, here's a way that there's sort of a stopgap to any issues that might arise that are anticipated or whatever. So I'm curious, did that happen, or has there been any thought of how to pair this with other things that are drawing the landlords in to utilize the program, either through necessity or desire or whatever they get? So
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not familiar with that background. I mean, I think in the end of the day, it's not politically realistic to force landlords to accept these voucher recipients. And so we're just trying to find any way that we possibly can so we can better utilize that resource. You know, as an advocate, it's unbelievably frustrating to work with someone to finally get that voucher support and then they can't actually use it.
Yeah, I just was going to say, I know Minnesota Housing did a whole literature design review of a whole bunch of models across the nation that would really showcase how people being inherited with different policy acts. So
there was a comment to look at Minnesota Housing's review of the landlord risk program and see if we can glean information of potential other policies that they combined with it to strengthen this particular idea. Oh no, that was from before. Any other questions? So again, the supportive, the housing, the bridges program, and then the landlord risk mitigation fund.
Great job.
One more in the back. Sorry.
Yeah, I just was going to ask about bridges. Can you remind me how many people are currently being served by that right now, and then how many with a proposal increase that? I just can't remember. You might have said that.
I didn't say it. I'm not sure what the number is off the top of my head. But I can figure it out.
Okay.
All right, thank you all.
Record time.
Wow. 26 minutes ahead of schedule.
I'm going to explain supportive housing for an hour. It's housing first. Tell me more.
Are you doing challenge first?
Yep. It should be 9. Actually, it got mixed up. 9. Well.
Well, I don't have a PowerPoint.
Okay, it's just me. I am here to talk today about the challenge program. It is a program that is typically included in the Homes for All budget, has a small increase. In my document, I said it is one of the sole appropriated. It is actually the only sole appropriated funding source to build and preserve affordable housing in Minnesota. As we all know, that around the state, as it is becoming increasingly harder to fund these projects, the gap is increasing, which requires more funds to complete projects. And also with the number of units that are requested or said to that Minnesota needs to build or preserve through the Affordable Housing Task Force report, 300,000 units in the next 10 years, 30 years. I can't even remember right now.
A lot of units.
But is it 30 years or 20 years or less?
I think it's a 10.
Okay, that's what I said first. Okay, apparently I was better, more on track. I've got like 2 hours of sleep last night, so. I am requesting that Homes for All take on a larger ask with an existing program that is already funded $15 million base increase for the challenge program. It is used 15. I mean, I would say 50, but I think that's, I think 15 is like stretching it, but 50 certainly would be. Again, challenge is kind of divided between Greater Minnesota and the metro area. It also is used for single family projects as well as multifamily. And the current FY 2018-2019 amount is set, well, it's like 29.8, but 4 million of that is the workforce housing, that program from DEED that was moved over. And I talked to Minnesota Housing and they said, yes, it's like tucked under challenge because that's where they decided to
put it. So optically, it looks like it's part of challenge, but technically it's not. So. And this, I just want to reiterate that this program, or this funding does serve the full continuum of housing. It is a gap filler for many different types of housing around the state. And I have talked to Minnesota Housing and asked them if this seemed like a reasonable request, and they said yes. So their request probably won't be this high. I think theirs is probably going to be closer to 6 or 8, but I think we as the housing advocates could ask higher than that. So, any questions?
Yeah, one right there.
Yes.
So as I understand it, so tell me if I'm wrong here, but when you reached out to Minnesota Housing, you explored with them kind of what's their known pipeline, in other words, and kind of what would the pipeline support? And so is that where you come up with that number, or was that the pipeline? Because I know there's also this effect of because the funds have been so constricted, there's been drop-off, so we're not really seeing the full pipeline of need reflected in the applications. So
thank you.
A little bit more about that number.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that question. So yes, I did have a conversation, and I will also just reiterate that I checked in with MCCD represents about 30 different affordable housing developers. We're a membership nonprofit organization, kind of quasi-trade organization, and many of our members use the Challenge Fund to build and preserve affordable housing, but many of them don't put in their full request for funding because they know that they just won't get it. So they're probably only asking to fund 2 different projects as opposed to maybe 5 of what they truly could do. So the pipeline probably isn't as accurate, but knowing what the pipeline is that we have for over subscriptions, they said that we could probably easily double, but 15 million would certainly be not out of stretch for being able to fully fund projects or using. I mean, Minnesota Housing said at least double of what it is, so.
Yeah, I just said maybe you won't know the answer to this. I can't remember the answer to this, but a couple of years ago, the legislature in the House, I think, was supposed to cut challenge or zero it out or something. Do you remember why that is and how, a proposal to increase it might be met?
Yep, and I think I wrote in here, I said there is the potential for the election to weigh into the outcome of this decision. But the funding for for the Challenge program has stayed flat or decreased since 2006. So it decreased a few years ago and now has come back up again to about the same level that it was in 2006. So I think there's just a lot of angst against Minnesota housing, as we all know, by particular lawmakers especially. But I think sometimes we have to be a little bold with our ask if we're going to really state the true need around the state. And I think that's pretty reflective in a lot of the requests that we're hearing at Homes for All or throughout our presentations. I would also say that I know there is, as many of you are aware, the Office of the Legislative Auditor is reviewing the Challenge program. I really don't know what is going to come out of that, but it is not going to be released until about January. So we may not know. We definitely shouldn't plan around that. However, there's potential if it does come out favorable. There might be some requests of MHFA to adjust their application process, is what I have been hearing, is something that they might recommend. There could be the potential also if it is favorable and seen as an economic boost, which is why they are reviewing it, because it's classified as technically an economic development program, that there could be a potential for a larger ask this year if the review is favorable. Any last questions on that? Okay. My next one is relatively easy, or maybe not easy, but certainly not lengthy. In conversations with MCCD members and then also hearing some things from different lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, we are asking for a policy proposal, no budgetary ask here, for setting all funding sources from Minnesota Housing at a minimum of 30-year terms of affordability. I saw a report recently from the National Low Income Housing Coalition that was pretty stark and basically showed that hundreds of thousands of units in the next 10 years are going to expire their tax credits, meaning people will be displaced. So we should maximize our existing resources, i.e. ensuring that all of our funding sources are able to be used for as long as they possibly can. And this would be for multifamily. I don't know that it would work necessarily for the single family side, except for land trust. So. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting proposal, and I know that this is getting a lot of conversation. And I think I even heard a candidate for governor, Jeff Johnson, talk about being supportive of longer affordability terms. I'm curious, just what's been the work around, like how this changes, if it does, the financing package that you need to put together around the project, because yeah, I think anything is possible, and yes, 15 years is, frankly, in my opinion, extremely short. But I know there's going to be some other impacts, and kind of what do we understand about those impacts, and also how they might play out in kind of these different markets other than, say, the core cities or the suburbs or all that.
So I've had some conversations with Minnesota Housing as well, and since all of the funds are oversubscribed, they don't see that this would be necessarily an issue. They'd probably want like an extraordinary circumstances clause in order to be flexible and adapt to markets should we go into recession again and we need to promote or incentivize development. Going basically like allowing 15-year terms again. So I'd probably write that in, but wanted to work with Minnesota Housing to write up that legislation. Also, most of the financing mechanisms, such as low-income housing tax credits and the 9% tax credits, housing infrastructure bonds, challenge fund, the trust fund, those are dollars that already have minimum 30 years, and Minnesota Housing is trying to incentivize 45 years, but it's a little harder to put that financing package together for longer than that. So it would primarily impact tax-exempt bonds as well as the 4% credits. Most of at least my members that use tax-exempt bonds and 4% credits do use them for 30-year terms of affordability. So it may impact for-profit developers more so than nonprofit developers.
Did you see the benefit they use supportive?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Any questions?
Did MHSA talk about the impact to for-profit developers specifically?
No, I brought that up. I mean, I know that would probably, that is just my read of things, because most of the 15-year terms of affordability are done by for-profit. The one instance also I know that I would need to do a little more research is in Greater Minnesota, if there are for-profit companies or that do affordable housing, if they're the only affordable housing developer, how that might impact markets in Greater Minnesota.
So could there be a variance for
like an exception type of thing? Yeah. Again, I think we should try to maximize our existing resources and prevent displacement from coming about every 15 years or so. I mean, nationwide, that number just escalates to the like half a billion units that we will potentially lose if they don't re-up their tax credits. In Minnesota, we can imagine it, we'd at least lose a few thousand potentially. So only exacerbating our tight housing markets as well as the growing homeless rates. And there's no budgetary ask. If anything, it probably like cuts back on, I don't know. It's like a cost savings. But yeah, and had heard this comment from Republican governor candidate Jeff Johnson, and has mentioned it to Tim Walz's staff as well. So. Any questions? All right, thank you. Appreciate your support.
Right, next we have Dominic from the Wilder Foundation. And
yeah.
Next slide, guys. Is it just
Clicker doesn't work.
5? And Dominic, are you just sticking with Homework Starts with Home?
Yep, I'm only doing one presentation, the Homework Starts with Home one.
10.5.
Trying to speed it up.
I wanted to clarify one thing. Pam was like asking something. The 15 million is not one time paid. Per biennium.
Hold on.
Trying to beat Sam's time.
Well, Shashi has all I want. I'm just saying. I'm sorry.
I don't know if anybody.
Enter.
They said it was here. Is it on? Did you do it back?
All right, whatever.
No. Here's the projector. Oh.
Okay, whatever. Don't need that, but I have a laser pointer now. Cool. Well, before I do get started, I just wanted to say that I am trying to appreciate people more. So I'm thankful for everyone in this room and all the hard work that they do. Woke up with some more immigration news and trying to find opportunities to appreciate the people who are working hard to make people's lives better. So thank you for being here today. I'm here to talk about Homework Starts with Home. And we've presented on the rental assistance pilot several times, and Homework Starts with Home specifically last biennium, so I'll try to be brief. So quickly, just on the need. So there are many measures that we use for student housing instability, which can be problematic, but the October 1 count from last school year was 8,700 on a single day, and recently the full school year numbers came out, and it was over 17,000 students were homeless over the course of the 17-18 school year in Minnesota. There is some noise in that because of the mobility of families and moving across school districts, so there is a little bit of double counting, but we also know that there is a good deal of undercounting in homeless populations as well. So this has been a growing issue over the course of time in Minnesota and continues to be something that's going to hold us back. And, oh, sorry, I was on the slide. I need to say next. There's a graph and some numbers. So this is something that affects every part of the state of Minnesota, every school district. You might not see it showing up, but there are students all across the state that this is affecting in communities. So next slide. So just some of the impacts that we see on students and there's a growing body of literature associated with this. This graph is actually from a study that was done in a metro school district in Minnesota. So showing decreased proficiency in reading and math. The main takeaway is basically that a student who has experienced homelessness when they're in 7th grade, they're essentially just finally catching up from a general, quote unquote, general population student in the 3rd grade in their reading proficiency. So I think that we all know that homeless students and families are very resilient, but if we're not providing with the opportunities to act upon that resiliency, then we continue to fail them. So there's also disparities in terms of chronic absenteeism, which is normally counted as about 10 days of absenteeism, 10 days of being absent in the homeless population in comparison to the not homeless population. And finally, a little bit of new information that came out last year, also using some data from Minnesota students showing that there were much higher rates of emotional distress, including thoughts of suicide and actual suicide attempts, to like about 3 times a student who was not in a homeless family. And a lot of the thinking historically has been, especially for students who have some of that family structure and aren't unaccompanied youth, that they're not as susceptible to some of those impacts in terms of the emotional distress because they have that family stability and unit. There is some of that, but this research is showing that those effects aren't as great as we would hope, and that these students who are in families are also under a great deal of emotional stress and strain. So just trying to call attention to the racial dynamic in this issue. 72% of the students facing homelessness in Minnesota are students of color. This information comes from MDE. American Indian Native students are over 6 times represented in the homelessness population in comparison to the general population, and Black students are 4.5 times. So the huge racial dynamic, and not an organizational stance, but a dominant stance that we might not allow this to occur if the numbers were flipped in terms of the majority population being truly representative of their population in the homeless population, especially when it comes to children. Just a brief program and legislative history. Like I said, this started as a pilot. We brought the pilot to the table before. The pilot was structured a little bit different than the current program, so now it has been rebranded as Homework Starts with Home. We were asking for $10 million across the biennium when we came in 2017, had a reduced ask in 2018 in the non-budget year. Oh, we moved on already, sorry. This is a look at the practice model that they're trying to use for the new program. So really trying to weave together a number of different things to intersect with this population, drawing in equity, people with lived experience, mainstream resources. I know as a part of the RFP, it had to be a collaboration between different actors, nonprofit, governmental, hopefully educational as well, to put together the proposals. So a little bit of the legislative history, started as a pilot. Eventually we got some bill language in 2017. It's been underfunded. Oh, that looks good on there. Looks bad on mine. It's been underfunded at every step. And these are the House authors and the Senate authors that we had in last session. So we've had a number of different authors when the Houses were under different leadership. We had support of the majority party each of the years. So last year we had Representative Prisha and Senator Weber. Next. So just a little bit about the program. I know that there were 15 applications for the program. Because of the underfunding, they only selected 5 sites, and a little bit about the breakdown. The Housing Trust Fund requests were 3 times the fund available, which matches pretty much 1-to-1 with the applications and the selections, but the FHPAP requests are actually 8 times in terms of the dollar amounts that were requested in comparison to what they were able to give out. So there's a great deal of interest in this and a ready-made pool of applicants. I talked with MDE, who actually is the home of the program, despite the fact that it's funded through MHFA, and they said, oftentimes in these types of RFPs, we have applications that are easy to throw out because they aren't up to snuff with some of the other ones, and that was just really not the case with this, that all the selections were very difficult and all of the applications were, they were worthy of being funded. It was just really a matter of the lack of resources available. So also in addition, right now, there's 2 years of funding for a really in-depth research into the program through the University of Minnesota, so the state's not having to pay for this. There's a forthcoming expanded evaluation of the pilot, and then there's, I think it's like 15 or 20 U of M faculty members, and then 5 graduate students who are actually doing research into some of the intersections around child welfare, school discipline, and how homelessness affects some of those other factors outside of just absenteeism and academic achievement. Yes. So what's the what? We are looking for inclusion in the legislative agenda, base funding increases to Homework Starts with Home funding sources, the Housing Trust Fund and FHPAP. So in 2017, we were able to secure $2 million across the 2 programs. MHFA actually kicked in some extra money from these programs. That was never the intention of us advocates to draw away resources. So at the very least, we would like to secure base funding and to make those funding resources whole in comparison to what they were previously, and having funds redirected at Hallmark Starts from Home. And under the right climate, we'd like to go for an increase, an overall increase, so that we could accept more of those sites that were worthy of being funded into the program. And this is helping in one of the best representations of trying to foster interagency collaboration, cross-issue, recognizing people as whole people and families as whole families, rather than as individuals who don't have an impact on each other's lives. Yeah, and that's it. Those questions.
What's the dollar amount? Sorry.
We don't have a current dollar amount. Okay. Are waiting for some of the same things that everyone else is waiting for. As I said, I think our minimum, like our floor, would hopefully be $2 million across the 2 programs, just to make those funding sources whole again. Yeah. So, but we would welcome a more sizable increase in the right climate, since there were a number of really great sites that were not able to be funded in this round.
Could you just do a quick overview of what those 5 sites are?
I actually am not able to, because the agency has not released them yet.
I
so
know.
They have not. A little bit, but I don't think I'm supposed to share it at this point. Yeah.
Since we've got just for ahead, just a point of curiosity really, is there any way that this overlaps with what Mayor Fry is proposing as a program from the city of Minneapolis?
So yes, I think the spirit of the 2 initiatives are the same, and they're drawing on a lot of the same background information, and also, you know, just it being the largest city in the state and situated in the largest school district, or not the largest school district, but the school district with the most homeless students, that the city of Minneapolis was trying to move forward in an analogous effort. I think their intention was to try to attach to this, at least in terms of some funding, or that would be the hope, but I know that they were committed to doing it no matter what. But as far as I know, there's no direct relationship between the 2. Good.
Any other questions? Any online? Nope. All right. Thank you, Don.
Sweet.
Thank you.
Okay.
Andy, you up? Oh, yeah. Wait, actually, wait. We give Amanda another spot. Oh, Amanda. She'll go after you then.
I'll be really fast.
Compared to the last course.
I'm going to be way faster than Dominic.
Faster than Sam?
Yeah.
That's just the voice.
Already?
Reshuffling the schedule a bit. So Andy will go next, and then following Andy will be Amanda from Micah.
We're out of here. Okay, so my proposal should be pretty simple. Many of you will be familiar with a piece of legislation that passed at the end of session last year, ended up getting included in the bonding bill. And it was sort of new language that hadn't been vetted, nobody had really seen it. And it dealt somewhat along the lines of the tax-exempt bond discussion that we started to hear about last week from Dominium, and I know Elizabeth is going to have some other things related to tax-exempt bonds.
Essentially what this did, and I should have brought handouts that actually just had the language that passed last year, but I failed to do that. It puts some restrictions around what MHFA can take into account when making funding decisions, and pretty harsh restrictions in my opinion. Honestly, it really stops the agency from having any Minnesota-specific priorities and limits the consideration to just things that are in federal law, and then includes some specific references to things that it absolutely cannot consider. In the Family Housing Fund and Greater Minnesota Housing Fund's opinion, the most egregious of that is that you can't even consider containment. And I think any of us that have spent any time talking to legislators, the cost of affordable housing, and as some people see it, we had a little bit of discussion on this last week, the fact that sometimes affordable housing costs more than market rate housing, and like those are ongoing costs or ongoing concerns that legislators have, or at least have expressed to us about why they're not interested in funding, putting more resources into affordable housing. And yet then they went and voted for something that says that the agency is by statute prohibited from considering the cost of development and deciding which ones to fund and which ones not. This is a little bit of conjecture on my part. I don't believe the legislature knew what they were voting on. It was something that came in at the very last minute. I think it was slipped in on the backs of another project that had some more popular support. I don't think there's any reason for this to exist in statute. I believe it'll be a fairly easy win for us to get this repealed. I'm willing to be proven wrong, but hopefully I'm not. So I don't know how much more detail folks want on it, but that's kind of the quick and short version. Sasha.
Is MHFA planning to try to repeal it?
So I've had some conversations with MHFA, and I should say there were two major components of it. We're looking at just one of them. So the second component that MHFA, I believe, is also interested in repealing is what's called the QAP alignment thing. And I'm not an expert on this, but it basically says that if you get approved for tax credits, you automatically get approved for tax exempt bonds, or maybe it's the other way around. We are sort of neutral on that, I guess. It's sort of an internal MHFA issue. But we would like to see the agency to be able to have some priorities. And maybe just some other examples of things that either are currently MHFA priorities or things that a new administration could propose that wouldn't be allowed under current law would be, so right now, other than just the cost side, which is a nice sort of shiny object in this issue, but there's things that MHFA currently says that to get funding, you have to be building with windows in every bedroom. That could go away, or would go away under this law. Any sort of veterans preference or regional distribution, preferences, that would all go away. Energy efficiency guidelines would all go away. None of these are addressed in federal law, and under the language that passed last year, it says you can't look at anything that's not specifically in federal law.
All right, one more. And linked affordability, is that?
Linked to affordability, yeah, to Carrie's point earlier, that is a, MHFA couldn't mandate. Obviously, if we passed a separate law that said you have to do that, then we'd have two different statutes in conflict, and it'd probably be, litigated.
Is like your consistent goal just a straight repeal, or could you see any other additional language changes from the previous statute coming into play as you try to revert it back?
I've taken an initial crack at some bill drafting. It is a little bit cumbersome, I think. They did a good job of intertwining the QAP alignment stuff with these other changes. I think I know how to do it, but I do have to do some more work with House Research or Senate Counsel to make sure that I'm doing it the way that I want to do it. But like I said, be neutral sort of on the QAP stuff. I don't think there's anything of the other piece that we want to repeal that's worth stating. Not yet. To sort of a political calculus, broader question. It's been brought up a couple times that Jeff Johnson has talked openly about, wanting cost containment as a, priority within affordable housing. It was not a change that was, supported by the Senate. Last year they sort of begrudgingly went along with it. But I think there'll be pretty broad support, and we're sort of waiting to see what the election, what happens with the election and going from there. I think as with the broader tax exempt bond change that Elizabeth is going to talk about later, Senator Draheim was our author in the Senate last year. He might be somebody that we would go to again should the Senate not split. I haven't decided that for sure.
Along those lines, is there overlap with that legislation? Because that was fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's related. I think you could do this without the consensus broader tax exempt bond changes. I think it would be trickier to do the consensus tax exempt bond changes without this, because those set up some other priorities and standards and such. So you'd again be in a place where you'd have different sections of law conflicting.
Yeah, I just thought I'd kind of put in there that, from what we've heard from both our nonprofit developer and for-profit developer members, is support for finding some way the QAP alignment piece kind of remains one way or another. Kind of before this happened, I think our position in MHC was we didn't think it needed to be a legislative change on there. It could happen another way, but we supported that. We were hearing that. So anyway, I appreciate that this is something that would try to find some way to keep that and
yeah. And some of the other conversations I'd had with Elizabeth prior to this is on things like cost containment, or on things like, I don't know if we talk about energy efficiency standards, but I imagine those would be similar. Different developers are going to see those issues differently, and we're not going as far as to put in statutes that these things should exist. It just kicks it back to the agency and the administration to be able to make those decisions. These are just complicated things that are going to change year in and year out, and having things in statute in these areas are probably not conducive to getting the best decisions made.
Yeah, I thought I would just kind of give one example that we talked about. So again, what I've heard consistently from folks we've talked to is of strong support that there has to be a cost oversight element, but kind of whether it's the particular box of cost containment or other things, I mean, that's kind of more an administration decision, and different administrations kind of line that up differently. And is that wise to put that, how you do it in law, as long as there's the ability to do that.
Sure.
I just wanted to make a comment that MCC members would support putting cost containment measures back in place. Obviously, if there is no limit on cost containment, as per unit cost goes up, our limited resources again get spent down faster. That is a concern that we have. Definitely willing to work to see what compromise is available, but I know that federal law has put it in place, so that I know there's a question of whether or not we're superseding federal law of they have cost containment in place. So I know there are larger issues at play, but it might just be easier to put it back to what it was.
Yeah, and just kind of to that, I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing, because cost containment is kind of like a more technical term of how you design whatever that cost oversight system, as opposed to just saying there has to be cost oversight. I think we fully agree there has to be strong cost oversight. How those boxes work together sometimes, that's where we're hearing.
Yeah, and I guess we've been using the term cost containment. The actual words in statute are shall exclude any per unit cost limitation, cost reasonableness, or other similar restrictions for residential rental housing. So, yeah. Yeah, cost containment is a little bit different thing. We were maybe using that term on the line.
I have one more question.
No, too many from the applicant.
Do we know where, so the bill language, as I recall, said a developer can challenge, or basically challenge
Yep.
an HSA's QAP, and federal law requires them to have a QAP. So we still don't know kind of where that lands, right? Or do we?
Yeah, so the latest that I've heard from the department, and don't quote me on this, is, despite that it's being recorded. Yeah, shut off the camera. My understanding is that the way that the statute was written and the effective date on it and sort of what stage of adopting the QAP they were in is they didn't include this change in this year's allocations. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that was my understanding. But that as we go into subsequent years, it will become a bigger issue. Does that get at your question? Okay. Is that faster than Dominic?
I mean, there were just more questions. That's the same, we get it.
Let's cue Amanda. Yes. Amanda, can you hear us? She's on. Okay, so we're going to unmute you because you want a minute. Amanda, you're unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Oh, you want to do? Yeah, quite well.
Okay.
Do you want to do video or do you want to just do audio?
It doesn't matter. This is this won't take long at all. It's basically a cut down version from what we started. Well, technically this is our 5th year, but the first year it was literally brought forth within like the last 30 days of session. So I like to say this is like our 4th year going into this. This lead legislation that Micah has been supporting has gone from basically working on lead prevention due to old window replacement to adding in changing the water in the lead pipes in someone's home and adding soil remediation outside the house. This year, we are specifically looking at just education and window, whether it be replacement or a something they call swabbing, which basically means going in and making the unit lead safe, going in and encapsulating the lead paint. Now, if we look at swabbing, the average cost per unit is $2,500 per unit. But because there isn't full window replacement, this can be done initially, depending on the unit, every 3 to 5 years, because the paint itself will degrade, but it does make the unit safer. We're looking more of pushing the cost savings on the Health and Human Services budget. Last year, that became a huge hot button in the legislature of how do we decrease the amount of money we're spending on Health and Human Services. Well, we decrease that by not allowing our children to be poisoned by living in the homes that they live in. The average cost, like I said before, to make a unit lead safe, because we do acknowledge that to make every unit abated by lead, the cost is just astronomical, $2,500. The average cost of a child being lead poisoned over the cost of their life is an average of $100,000 per year. And in 2016, we still had 862 children that were poisoned in the homes that they live in that potentially could have been taken care of with $2,500 a unit. So the last couple years, we've had great support in the House, especially with Representative Garofalo, and we keep getting stopped in the Senate. So we are changing our author this year in the Senate. November 13th, we are meeting with Senator Little. As most of you know, we had 3 bus tours here within the last couple months, and I feel that the movement in the Senate will be greater this year. Doing more research, and if you look at the information sheet that I provided for you, the rural counties that we'd be focusing on are primarily Republican senators. And one of them is Senator Draheim, which we see as a housing hero. So we will definitely be trying to work more closely with his office, but also like Julie Rosen down in the southern part of the state, and Gary Downs has actually 2 counties in his area that test, their lead testing levels are double what the state average is. So what we're looking at is the last 2 years, this proposal has made it into conference committee up until within minutes before it goes to a final vote. And at that time, the year before last, it was $1 million, and last year it was about $780,000. So knowing that we have strong support on the House side, no matter which way this flips, the focus this year will be pushing it more on the Senate side and focusing on saving those dollars, not only in health and human services, but in special ed services. So we have families that are willing to give their personal stories and have done this year after year to pull this forward. Sustainable Resources in Minneapolis is willing to do the outreach, because what we're noticing, and I'm sure you've heard from the Eastside Neighborhood Development when they presented on their legislation, was that the rural counties just don't have the manpower to be doing the testing that needs to be done and the follow-up. So, you know, as I told you that they had gone to Albert Lee, and we have spoken to Rochelle through Sustainable Resources, who has also been part of our news reports and everything else. Carol Levin is still interested in following up on things as we move this forward. KSTP has been working with one of our families through the Northern Metals situation, where that lawsuit money is now starting to be decided, and how that is going to be used within the community. So Micah's ask this year is basically to copy the language of last year, which means it would be a pilot program to increase the amount of testing that is done and education that is needed to ensure that the homes are safe. The money would go through the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, just as it was listed the last 2 years when it went into conference committee. So we don't feel there would be an issue with the agency taking on that role again. The reason why we're looking at a $2 million ask is start a little bit bigger than what we've gotten close to the last couple of years. And we don't want it to be too big where we're setting anyone up to fail, because this is used as expansion dollars. And currently right now, the state of Minnesota as a whole only gets the last lead funding they received for healthy homes was about $654,000 for the state. And in order to clean up the lead that is causing hazards in the current 359,000 occupied homes with lead hazards, it would be about $1 million per census tract. So in the scheme of, we understand that the ask overall may look small, but this is something we're looking on building upon. So initially with a pilot program, it would be a one-time ask. We would look at who is applying for it, how is the money being used, are we reaching out more than just the metropolitan area, and then potentially year after year trying to expand on that amount. Is there any questions?
Thanks, Amanda. Any questions? I have a question. I'm coming up closer. Maybe you said it, but I just didn't hear it. What are the total number of homes till we get like pure lead abatement? That need to be.
There is currently, and this comes directly from the departments from the state, there are 359,000 rental units in the state of Minnesota that still have high potential lead hazards. And that's just rental. That's not even including, yes, 359,000. And obviously, because when we start reaching out to the rural areas, like around the Albert Lee area, they have one public health nurse that works on the lead referrals when a child does test high for lead for 4 counties. So it is a totally different dynamic when we're looking in the metro area where there are more resources. The 2 main agencies that receive the funding from the federal dollars every year are in the metro area. And like I said, both Sustainable Resources and Eastside Neighborhood Development Company are both working on extending their outreach, taking their resources out to the rural counties and working with their public health agencies to expand the use of dollars to ensure whether it's doing the lead, the encapsulation of the lead paint, where we're basically sealing it up. And, like I said, from the talks we've had with the Minnesota Department of Health and contractors, that's something that would have to be done every 3 to 5 years. But full window replacement is about $8,000 to $10,000 a unit. So expanding this outwardly, and another thing I don't think a lot of people realize is, when we rent somewhere, the landlord is required by law to give you this little pamphlet that says there may be lead hazards, and this is how you keep yourself safe. Those same landlords are, when they go through the multi-housing association, directly from the attorney's mouth, they are talked to, basically educated for 15 minutes on lead hazards. So the landlords themselves are not educated well enough on how serious a lead poisoning for a child could be. And this just is, it is affecting more of low-income families high. But like I said, something that needs a greater outreach.
Question.
Yeah.
There are a couple other questions, so just want to be able to get to those.
Yep.
Are lead pipes also an issue?
I don't know if I should look at you or speak to you. Are lead pipes also an issue that is factored into this?
Currently, the way our legislation is written, the lead pipes are not written into this. That is something that Karen Clark, who is now retired, had put in her legislation, but we could never get that pushed forward enough. They felt it was too broad. That's something we would like to look at. It's a matter of adding filters to the water systems if you can't replace the lead pipes themselves, but yes, that has been a concern for quite some time.
And then I just asked Erin a quick follow-up. Erin from the Preservation Alliance was the one that asked that. Is that an issue that you see in the work that you do?
Well, I mean, I think it certainly could be, and especially when we're talking property to property. Like system-wide, we don't have in terms of like a municipal water system or their lead pipe system. But like within that home, I think it certainly could be.
Lead paint,
and that's where you would find it. And if these are houses that haven't been maintained or upgraded in any substantial way in 50 years, there's definitely lead, and that's a hazard.
Somebody was Erin from the Preservation Alliance was saying that in homes, lead paint is an issue as well, and potentially lead pipes too. So,
right.
Are there other questions?
I will share that there was another proposal focused on lead from the Eastside Neighborhood Development Company in conjunction with St. Catharines, Secura, Sisters of St. Joseph, and Assistance from Environmental Advocacy, Freeborn County United Way, and the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, requesting similar initiatives of the legislature.
But they did not present. They thought maybe
Michael would be.
Yeah, Amanda, they didn't end up presenting. They thought you could take it this year, but they weren't quite. We weren't organized enough to.
Yeah. We did meet with them prior to the Homes for All's set up meeting times, and they just felt that at this time they weren't comfortable with doing the policy work. But what we did ask of them is getting us stats if there were specific hearings that we needed information about their specific areas to get this funding, if they would willing to be part of a supportive role. So that's what we're working on with them. You know, because they're doing a lot of stuff. So
from an equity stand, I think they have some important numbers. One of them is that, like most states, lead poisoning in Minnesota has pesticides in the inner cities and 4 rural communities. In Minnesota, roughly 3% of our census tracts have child lead poisoning rates higher than Flint, Michigan. So we're focusing on those particular issues as well.
Yes, exactly. And we have those numbers, and it shows the overreach of lead poisonings versus consistent evictions, unfortunately. So we're having children, low-income families, moving into these houses that are not safe, and because of financial reasons or something, because they're being evicted. So what we're doing is we're constantly putting a new set of children into homes that need to be cleaned up. And especially around the St. Paul, Minneapolis area, some of the numbers are as high as 10%. And Flint, Michigan's at 5%. And Albert Lee is also one of those in the rural area, which we would be focusing on.
Thank you, Amanda. We appreciate you being able to call in, and we're really happy that the technology actually worked. It wasn't working that great earlier.
I'm actually in St. Peter, so I'm not that far away from you. So have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. All right. Now we are on to our last proposal, which there are 4, but still, I think they'll go. There's less transition text, so we got it.
Some of them we've heard before.
We've got 2 hours. So.
Oh my God. We can do it in an hour, then maybe we can stop against the time.
Yeah.
So we're moving on to, which one are you doing? Tax credits? What order are you going in?
I put tax exempt bonds first.
I'll do the tax exempt bonds. That's really very short.
So you're in third. You're at third 13.
I can just go in the order it's in. So.
Yeah, there's not a PowerPoint.
There's no PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yep. All right, so as you're pulling stuff up for folks watching, my name is Elizabeth Glidden, and I'm with the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and I'm channeling my colleague Libby Murphy, who is normally the person here, and I've told her I'm just trying not to make any big mistakes. So the first proposal that we have is about tax-exempt bonds and what has been described as the 5 consensus agreements. So and this kind of relates back to what Andy Pomeroy was describing in his presentation. But in 2018, Minnesota Housing Partnership, along with the Family Housing Fund and Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, were partners in convening a process to look at the process of allocating tax-exempt bonds, and what came out of the process were these 5 consensus agreements. which include funding projects using bonds for 55% of costs or less first, prioritizing projects with deeper affordability, fully funding randomly selected projects, prioritizing senior housing and Section 8, and then requiring a firm 18-month limit on closing. And because that's all really a mouthful and a technical topic, it was popularly called the 5 consensus agreements. So this is a proposal that Homes for All supported last session, and Andy has already given background on what happened, which was not the 5 consensus agreements getting put into law. So we thought we just wanted to make sure, since this is a 2-year proposal process, that this priority just didn't get lost. We would not move forward without the other partners who had worked on this previously, which is Family Housing Fund and Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. And as Andy said, their priority for this session is more repealing some objectionable language and kind of finessing that and working on that proposal. So this would really be about keeping it on the agenda, seeing if there was an opportunity perhaps in the next year to move this forward, and that might be something we just continue to assess together. So I think that's about it on this. If there's questions. Not seeing questions. Any questions on mine? Nope. Okay. So the next one that we have is Local Housing Trust Fund, I think.
And that's 14.2. You can begin on that.
Okay, thanks. All right, so our next proposal is a state match for local housing trust funds. So local housing trust funds, they are a popular concept around the country. I'm on the second slide right now if you're in that. They're a popular concept around the country. Almost 800 housing trust funds have been established in cities, counties, and states. And with the intention that this is a way of dedicating public funds to a specific purpose, which is affordable housing. Some numbers that are out there about these funds are that they leverage quite a bit, leverage about $8.50 per every public dollar. Minnesota Housing Partnership has had a multiple-year history on working on local housing trust funds at the state level, as well as with consulting with local communities in Minnesota about local housing trust funds. In 2017, we were able to achieve what's called enabling legislation for local housing trust funds. And essentially what that did is it helped set a common definition and created an expectation then for local jurisdictions about their ability to move forward with setting up these funds. It was not a requirement for funds to be established, but it provided a mechanism and a clearer path for local communities to move forward with these funds. The next step, we believe, is to establish state matching funds as a way to incentivize local government investment in housing. So, go back.
What number are you on? 5?
I don't have a number. I'm in a different number.
Why a state match?
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so there is an organization, the Center for Community Change, that has a big national project on local housing trust funds. They've done some research on what's the ability of a state match to help leverage local communities to create local housing trust funds, and according to their research, it really has a great track record once you put into place a state matching fund of then incentivizing the creation of these local housing trust funds. And you still have the other benefits that exist from local housing trust funds, which is enabling participating jurisdictions to really have flexibility in designing their own trust funds. And it's a good way to try to incentivize trust funds to be established all throughout Minnesota, reaching rural jurisdictions, according to their research. Last year, this was on the legislative agenda with a $2 million proposal, which was not achieved, which is why I'm back. We think it also aligns with the governor's task force on housing and some of the recommendations there. We also know that this is a proposal that has been very popular with local governments and HRAs based on calls for technical assistance that we get to our office and other communication we've had with the League of Minnesota Cities and Metro Cities. Let's see here. So for the 2018 legislative session, just some data on our authors. We were incorporated in the MHFA appropriations bill. So that's just an outline of that. So for this session, I will say my understanding is that when we came up with the $2 million number for the state match fund, this was, of course, trying to do some political assessment of what was feasible, knowing there are other Homes for All proposals. What I have put on the proposal is that we are recommending a $10 million, it would be a one-time fund for the match, but we are very flexible on this, and we think, you know, we're going to have to look at if this does move forward with Homes for All support, kind of what's the whole package of asks, as well as what happens in the election and other things. The concern with the $2 million is just it's not very much to spread around if we're incorporating matches for local communities. So that's about it. Any questions, Sasha?
Thank you. I appreciate that the ask is greater. I know that was some feedback we got from our housing staff is that the $2 million that wouldn't go very far. I was just curious if you've thought about how the bill would be structured. I know in the past there was some concern in the language to make sure that one large community doesn't eat up all the funding, for example, and then also wondering about the local match, if that would be flexible in terms of the sources that would qualify for the state.
Yeah, so my understanding is that last session there was some dialogue about how to make sure that the local sources were flexible enough to kind of, just to the Minneapolis example, kind of match up to what different communities were doing that had already established their trust funds, and then what other communities would be doing. And so we are still open to kind of how we're going to make this something that works for jurisdictions in Minnesota that we know already have trust funds, as well as incentivizing others. And so a yes to that. As far as the amounts, say that again.
I think there was some language in there just to ensure that multiple, or that it wouldn't all go, like the $2 million, for example, wouldn't all go to one community or something like that.
Yep, there was some language in there, and it kind of had capped what would be the match. And so I think, again, that's language that we can continue to play with, depending on what's the amount that ends up being the ask and how that matches up to the language.
I have a question.
Yep.
Just curious, and I'll probably ask this on your other presentations as well, if you've had conversations with Minnesota Housing about this particular policy and what their reaction is. Certainly just want to remind the room too, like this particular proposal was talked about at the Lieutenant Governor Forum, and both candidates said this is something of interest. Certainly know that local communities are interested in it, and it's greater ownership role. So yeah, I think there's an obvious interest from
Yeah, so I know that over the years there has been a lot of conversations with Minnesota Housing. I was part of a conversation this summer with Minnesota Housing, just prepping for kind of what was interest for the next session. They are very supportive of local housing trust funds. I think they're also open to what are ways to provide more opportunities for local communities to come up with what's the revenue. But again, that's not exactly part of our proposal right now, and I think that will also be something to assess after the election. So in other words, whether there's new mechanisms to allow cities to come up with revenue to meet their match other than what they already have access to, which is property tax, HRA levy, and other pass-through funds.
Quick follow-up is, have you heard if Minnesota Housing is putting any funding in their budget that presents you the next government on the trust fund?
I will just say what I've heard. So I think that Minnesota Housing had put a proposal, several proposals in their proposed budget that aligned with things that you're hearing here. I can't say specifically if they ended up putting this. Again, they've told me that they're very supportive of it. My understanding is that there's a process going on right now where all the agencies are essentially being told, go back to your base budget and make sure that you just got a good foundation, you know, as they're preparing for the next governor. So I think there's some iteration that's going on in there. So I don't know how we're going to see those budgets look like as we go and transfer from one administration to the next. So
yeah, I mean, that's true with everything.
Yep.
In the budget.
So I think they have been supportive. I don't know specifically if they ended up putting it in.
Any other questions? Questions on the phone? No one said anything on there, no? All right, fantastic. Moving right along.
All right.
The next one we have is the tax credit.
Tax credit.
I think it's 14, 15.
Number 15. And just, there were a couple of attachments that I think got connected to this tax credit proposal, but they were actually, I think, associated with the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota's proposal. Just as an FYI, I don't know that it matters that much, but just for folks to know. So tax credit, contribution fund. Again, this is a repeat proposal from what folks heard who have been involved in Homes for All for a couple years. We know that private market and affordable funding sources are not keeping up with demand, so we've got a big gap. We also know that there's a lot of I think discussion that we heard, especially at the governor's task force, about how are we better leveraging the public dollar to bring in private investment around affordable housing. Another just piece, I think, around why a tax credit contribution fund makes sense is that a tax credit is a familiar mechanism around housing, and so it, I think, is a mechanism that those who work in that housing field are more attuned to kind of understanding how it might support greater investment. Just a couple words on how this works. So there's kind of two parts of the process. One is you're an applicant, and if you are an eligible applicant, then you are applying to the state agency for funds. You will be issued a conditional commitment for funds, during which time you would then have the opportunity to solicit contributions. Contributions can be applied to your project from a tax credit contribution fund, either because a contributor wanted to designate those contributions to your project, or there is a pool of funds from which you're allocated. The other side to this is if you are a contributor to a tax credit contribution fund, so you can contribute if you are someone that has tax liability, state tax liability of any kind. In exchange, you receive a dollar for dollar certified state tax credit against your state tax liability. And then again, you're able to contribute that directly to a specific project or to a general loan pool. Some of the benefits of a tax credit contribution fund, leveraging private investment. Again, I will say this is something that we are hearing a lot more, is how are we ensuring that private investors are participating in community need for affordable housing. This particular articulation of a tax credit is very flexible. And so it is a mechanism that doesn't add a lot of red tape to your project, but is a way that you're able to bring that project to conclusion very simply. Because this is a simple design of a one-to-one credit, you are not required to use syndicators or lawyers or other expensive professional staff to ensure that you're properly putting together your application for tax credit. And another thing that we have understood is that this came about from reaching out to developers that work both in the metro area and in greater Minnesota. There have been other tax proposals that have been presented at the state of Minnesota, some of them modeled more on how you might replicate a federal tax credit as a state model. And what we continued to hear was that particularly for greater Minnesota projects, those are very inefficient tax credits and would not in the end help projects come to fruition. So we have heard a message over and over again from greater Minnesota developers that this is a model they think would be more helpful to them being able to bring their projects to fruition. And I should have said probably at the beginning that this design is based on a North Dakota tax credit contribution fund. I think they call theirs the Housing Incentive Fund. This proposal was based on experience as well as design of how that tax credit worked in North Dakota, and it has been in place since 2011, has been reauthorized by the legislature multiple years. It's still an active program, and we've continued to hear many positive things, both from developers as well as from just kind of the state and how the projects are moving forward. Positives on that. Just a couple things on the policy details associated with the tax credit contribution fund. The income requirements or affordability requirements in the legislation have been designed to align with the challenge fund. And so those parameters are 80% for multifamily and 115% for single family projects. Again, this is, the legislation has been very broad serving so that you could use this for a whole variety of purposes, including refinancing, new and rehabilitation purposes, acquisition and demolition. So again, a very flexible use of those funds. And then I put in a couple of examples that we've heard from developers. One is just that this is a good mechanism for essentially missing gap financing for 4% tax credit projects. You've heard from other proposals that existing funds that like the challenge fund that kind of help with that are extremely oversubscribed. So we have this huge backup of need. This would be a way to assist with that. Another example that's been used to us is developers saying that they believe they could achieve deeper affordability on projects, so allowing you to get more to that 30% AMI level or 50% AMI level by replacing your first mortgage financing with funds from the tax credit contribution fund. So Homes for All, in 2018, it was on the, and am I saying this right, the support agenda, and then as the session moved forward and there became, I think, both greater familiarity with the proposal and it gained some momentum, it kind of graduated its place in the agenda, but it started as on the support agenda. It's also, the tax credit contribution fund has been called out specifically in the governor's task force on housing as a key idea to move forward that would be associated with creating, they put it in the section that was on creating dedicated permanent funding sources for affordable homes. This is, I think MHP has been doing more work than often we have done on trying to identify both a good foundation of support from those who work around housing, but also trying to go outside of that foundation of support to talk more to local government, to employers about how this is an important part of funding affordable housing and how it can provide significant additional investment for affordable housing statewide. So this is just a little bit of kind of what we've been trying to do to make sure that we have the momentum that will move this forward. On our authors, we had, I think, very good bipartisan support for this, which allowed it to have multiple hearings in a first session, which we thought was really great momentum for a brand new idea. And so we think that regardless of the election results, this still will have, because it had good bipartisan support, will still have legs to move forward. The amount might be something more to consider. And then again, to the amount, what was requested in the 2018 session was $25 million annually as a credit. And for 2019, what we've put into this, and I'll tell you a little bit more why we put this number, was $50 million. But again, I think this really depends on kind of forecast and some other indicators that we hear about what's the right amount on this. We picked the $50 million for a few reasons. One is we have been in extensive conversations with Minnesota Housing about how they view this, how they think it would add to existing tools, and what they think is the demand that could take advantage of this. And they have indicated they think that this would be a reasonable amount that, in their opinion, would actually be subscribed, and then be able to show how this tool could be used into the future, and if it needs to be increased or what have you. And there below, I kind of showed a little bit of the North Dakota history. And again, North Dakota is a much smaller state, and this was how they were able to fully utilize those funds. So that's it. Sorry I was so long on this one.
Question.
Yep. There's one.
How and whether, and maybe we don't know enough about it yet, the opportunity zone funding, which is kind of the same thing. It's like trying to attract private capital investment into that. How would this here with that? Is this just state?
You know, I've had that question before, and it's a question that I've been trying to just see if LISC, perhaps, who works more with those opportunity zones, could help us with. To be honest, I am not sure. I think kind of just because these are both like investment opportunities, there seems like some similarities, but I'm not sure that they actually intersect in operationally. So with this particular construction. What is appealing, as we understand it, to investors is that it's just sort of a one-time exchange. So you have tax liability. You then are able to make a contribution, and in that same year, you get a tax credit. So there is no requirement for you to have a longer term relationship with a project. And, you know, for many, say you're an employer who is excited about affordable housing projects in your community, but you don't dabble in real estate, you know, this is a way for you to be part of that project and support housing without having to have that ongoing relationship. I'm not familiar enough with the Opportunity Zone funds to kind of understand how those work. I do know there's sort of a longer timeline for how that plays out and the benefit to you as an investor in an Opportunity Zones fund. Like over 10 years, I think, so.
I was just gonna say,
Yep.
yeah, my affordable housing developers that I work with, they are very highly skeptical that Opportunity Zones are going to be a real solution for building more affordable housing.
As a reminder, speak up, one, and then if you have a question in the back, speak up even more, sorry. But the question that was just answered and discussed briefly was, how does this tax credit proposal relate to the Opportunity Zones, the funding as well? And Elizabeth, you share that. We do have a question online, and even with classes, I'm blind, so I think it's how, Elizabeth, did you say this was proposed for the past few years or part of the agenda for the past few years?
Right, so this was a new proposal in 2018. And so it was presented to Homes for All as part of the policy adoption process for the 2018 session, and it was approved on the support agenda. And then maybe someone here can help me with the description of that. My understanding is during the session, just as things continued to be evaluated, it kind of moved from a support item.
I'm not sure that it was.
Okay, then I'm saying it wrong. So
it didn't formally move up, but
okay.
I will chime in and say that I was probably the person with the most questions about the tax credit, just because it wasn't drafted when it was proposed last year. Yep. But then I worked really closely with Libby to draft the language, and we worked pretty closely during the legislative session. So this is something that MCC has been continuing to work on, growing support with, along with MAC and your support of.
Well, and I will add that it wasn't included for various reasons. One of the main reasons was because it wasn't a complete proposal. There were still components of it that were still being hashed out, and why it couldn't be voted on because it wasn't full yet. And so throughout session, the work was done and then elevated as it became a bit more relevant and complete.
I don't think we want to get the impression that something needs to be elevated during session. We actually have
okay. That's why I apologize. I was describing this.
It was probably more of a like MCCD elevated it, right? To work on it, right? I mean,
okay, right. That's exactly what happened. NHC and MCC worked collaboratively at the large. Yeah.
Okay.
Those are the new messages.
I think.
Or maybe they just can't hear it again.
Thanks for clearing that up.
So, any other questions on this? Could you just maybe talk about the like support and work that you're doing?
Yes, so I did have a slide on our support in how we're trying to reach beyond, both ensure that we have strong housing community support, but also reach beyond that so that we're showing some unusual partnerships and other things that are going to be able to kind of move lawmakers. One new thing I think has been our attempt to reach out and get business community support. The Minneapolis Regional Chamber has identified this as an item that will be on their legislative agenda for the next year. They also have been helpful to us, and housing is a new area for them to work on too. So they are looking for additional items that they may work on in the future beyond this. So my understanding is their housing interest is not confined to this. They are also helping us and reaching out to other chambers and other employers. We are another just example of an employer relationship we're trying to work on is in Thief River Falls with DigiKey, and that's thanks to Carrie at MCCD. Who has a relationship with Thief River Falls. We also have been working with local government, and so a lot of those membership organizations will finalize their policy adoption process at the end of the year, but my understanding is the League of Minnesota Cities and Metro Cities both have language that would be conducive to supporting this as part of their agendas. So those are a couple of examples of how we're trying to move continue to move support. So.
All right. Thank you. Last one, everyone.
All right. Woo.
Last one is number 16, and it's on dedicated.
Okay. So dedicated funding for housing, and I might just, there's a couple slides I have at the beginning that really are just repeating what we've heard from some other speakers. So maybe if we just page through those quickly. One is, this is the slide that we needed for the Challenge Fund on how we're oversubscribed for existing programs. We've also been talking, this next slide is about kind of how not only are we oversubscribed and not able to fund the full continuum, but we know there's gaps that are hitting particular ends of the continuum. And so it's those families with the greatest needs for housing at the 30% and 50% who are not seeing the housing production that's needed. Then my last slide here just on context was our slide on what percent housing is of the full state budget, which is minuscule. So dedicated funding for housing, this is a key recommendation of the governor's task force on housing. And the Minnesota Housing Partnership has had an interest in working on dedicated funding for housing for multiple years, and I know other organizations have as well, working on what are those ideas that move forward a greater investment in funding. Just again, as some big picture comments, dedicated funding is not uncommon at the state level in Minnesota. And I think we've heard at least 2 other proposals to Homes for All that were on the concept of dedicated funding for housing. Also mentioning how other priority areas in the state use this as a mechanism to fund their needs to greater levels. Across the country as well, we're seeing both states and cities really step forward with big, bold ideas for funding housing in more permanent and sustainable ways with dedicated funding sources. And so with all the conversation about housing in Minnesota, we need to see how can we translate that to a more appropriate investment in affordable housing at all levels. We have been working to develop a policy that would support dedicated funding for housing. I don't have this in my PowerPoint, but I did in the actual idea submission, is that we're really looking at a big, bold number that would be, again, more appropriate to funding the ongoing needs for affordable housing in Minnesota, and we've been talking about a number that's $250 million a year. We have started some processes with stakeholders and have been meeting with a variety of folks who work in housing, from the advocacy end of things to the developer end. We have been also reaching out to both local government, business community, and trying to reach both into rural Minnesota for perspective as well as the metro area. Again, I think this is work that was done as well by the Governor's Task Force on Housing. And so our work was a little bit more to how do we start building a policy for how would we prioritize any new funding for housing. And so these are some principles that came out of that process, that new funding would serve the greatest needs, be flexible to local needs and community-driven solutions, be sustainable and predictable, which I think is a very key point to this, and be outcome-driven. We also asked some more specific questions about how new funding should be prioritized, and time and again, we received responses that we need to fill gaps that are today not being filled, with serving those at 30% and under and 50% and under, with a range of options that could include rental assistance. Some of these, as you know, are repeating what we've heard from other proposals, and so that's why this is kind of a big picture proposal. Other things that consistently have come up is reducing racial disparities with new funding and ensuring that there is balance between funding that would serve the lowest income households with serving the full continuum of housing needs. In addition, we have been doing some work through MHP on trying to identify what might be sources that could be utilized for dedicated funding for housing. And so this is work that's been ongoing. There has been both research work that has been done, but also probably in some ways more importantly, work that's more stakeholder work, as well as continuing to touch base with lawmakers. I put this slide in, this next one, because we are thinking about this as a multiple year effort to gain momentum and build power together around being able to see the kind of permanent, sustainable investments in housing that are really needed to serve communities across Minnesota. And we know that this is something that will require the support of Homes for All, but more. So it's sort of one of those things where we both need to know that the housing community is supportive of how do we move forward with big, bold statewide solutions, but we also are going to have to build a more powerful base that goes beyond kind of what often are our traditional partners in order to move lawmakers to the understanding that what is today in place is not sufficient. So I know that this is, again, a proposal that is more at the kind of big picture vision level. We have been doing work to try to also identify how would you take that into a more specific policy proposal. We have been continuing our work with stakeholders to do that. I do believe that as one of the top recommendations from the Governor's Task Force on Housing, that it would be important and helpful for Homes for All to help steer this proposal to be something that we all want to participate in. So I'm not sure what that looks like in terms of kind of how we're thinking about where things that are not really at the let's pop it into the bill hopper, or even if we did, that it's more of just trying to get reaction to ideas where that lands on the Homes for All agenda. But again, I just will say I think this is something that is important for Homes for All to have its stamp of approval and help to shape as it continues to kind of grow, and that relationship I think would be important to have, especially as this is the group that brings the policy expertise around housing together in one place. I should say just one other thing is that I guess how we are also envisioning this, and I kind of referred to this with my other proposal around the tax credit, is that achieving the tax credit might be viewed as one leg of this. But again, we wanted to make sure this was presented as a separate proposal, because I do think it is a separate policy idea, especially as how we're looking at both the uses and the sources are very different from what would be involved in a tax credit contribution fund.
question?
Yep.
So it sounds like there's not specific sources identified at this point. And if that's correct, also wondering like if there was $100 million in bonding with that, or like, you know, would you perceive that as something for this? I just want to make sure I'm understanding it.
So, yep. So Sasha asked, is it true that sources have not been finalized, I think is the question, because sources have been identified, but I think decisions haven't been finalized. And also as a part two is how does bonding fit into this? Which I think is a really good question. So on the sources, again, we have been doing both research on the sources and talking to both lawmakers and stakeholders to kind of get reaction. So I think that post-election, we could be have something that felt more like a proposal that might have multiple sources on it that we could bring back with that feedback that we would gain post-election. If that was of interest, just again to kind of, if this group was willing to kind of be part of sort of that iterative process. Around the bonding, I think that is a really important question, especially because of, I'll mention two things. One is because Homes for All traditionally has been extremely successful, both in kind of envisioning a new path for how bonding is used for housing and then being able to kind of replicate that multiple times. And I understand in a meeting with Representative Hausman, who's kind of been the champion on bonding and housing in general, she also identified her vision as being we would get $100 million in bonding, I think it was annually or biannually, but with a regularity. So I think that that should be something that could be incorporated. And again, this is sort of the bread and butter of Homes for All. So I kind of put that to how does that fit within the Homes for All strategy.
So I want to thank Elizabeth. She met with us individually and really appreciated that. And additionally, your flexibility, focusing on new revenue, those are all positive things. But NAMI is opposed to this. We continue to have strong concerns about legislating in this manner, particularly in the context of other similar proposals when it comes to constitutionally dedicating funding for roads and bridges. I think we are concerned this will negatively impact the Human Services budget. Yeah, I don't need to harp on this, but that's just where we as an organization are, and that comes from the board down, and so we're opposed. But again, thanks for meeting with us. You've been really productive and helpful. So.
Yeah, and I will say just, so I appreciate you raising those concerns. Anytime you use the words dedicated funding come out of somebody's mouth, I mean, there are different approaches to whether that is, I think, a smart idea or a bad idea, whether that helps your policy objective or hurts your policy objective. And so, I think it's very appropriate that you're raising that. I understand your organization's position. I think right now, because we are still trying to understand how a proposal could best be framed, we're still a little bit in that, well, not a little bit, we're still in that vague area. And my understanding was that it might depend a little bit too on what actually ended up getting put on paper to kind of how NAMI might position itself, still recognizing this is not something that you favor. So I'm clear on that.
That's
yeah.
Right. Sort of having a regular bonding dollars, for example, is something we wouldn't be opposed to. But.
Okay.
Just because we have a different mix of people in the room than the presentation that you gave, which was really helpful to the policy team. I remain a little bit cautiously afraid of, there's 44 proposals this year, and there's a lot of, I feel like, vagary around amounts as people are waiting for fiscal numbers, but a lot of clarity around the policy pieces. And I have concerns about having something that has a very clear and large amount, but pretty vague policy terms of the revenue sources at this point and how it could, putting that on the agenda and its ability or potential to cannibalize other smaller efforts that might be a little bit more ready to go on the agenda.
Yeah, so thanks for raising that. I think I should say with this, kind of as with other things, I don't feel like we need to put a number with the proposal. If that's something that helps in thinking about how to position this. And yes, we've heard a lot of proposals for funding needs as part of this process with 44 proposals. And again, I guess I'm kind of looking to how we might be able to position this in a way that Homes for All can continue to help kind of steer and guide it, as opposed to it sort of being off to the side, but yet not be messaged in a way that detracts from the other more specific proposals at this point. So maybe that's a way that we could think about. Is there a way that kind of the messaging or the narrative around this could be positioned in a way, you know, again, as this is a more general proposal as opposed to the others, which are more specific to particular program needs.
I have it's probably too soon, it's a strategy question, but I remember hearing some comments from more Democratic lawmakers and Republican lawmakers about being concerned about, are we picking winners and losers, and just wondering if you've got given some thought to messaging around kind of that narrative too.
Well, just to that end, I will say kind of as we're thinking about, even though I called this dedicated revenue, and in part I did that because it was the language from the governor's task force. But I think using that language, dedicated revenue, really just even by itself without kind of seeing what's the policy attached to that or what's the source or how would that sit, you know, it sets a certain course. And so I think we're trying to figure out how do we be honest about we're looking for permanent sustainable sources or what is that without using language that already kind of boxes folks in. So again, with like the tax credit, I think some might think of that as being, if it was an annual appropriation, is that something that is sustainable, predictable, dedicated, but yet the authors, many of the authors from 2018, I think would really not like that characterization of it. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question. I do think there are, just to Nami's point, certain both individual lawmakers and organizations that will have a definite point of view on dedicated revenue. And I guess, again, I would just kind of make the point that I think it's time for housing to kind of be louder and bolder with how we try to move something forward. And sometimes you have to ask for something big to even get this thing. So not to be, you know, too cute about it, but that's just sort of the reality. So I think we have just a tremendous, you know, resource in Minnesota with having a Homes for All, with having all the momentum that's been happening around the state, with having this governor's task force on housing. And I think the question is, how do we turn that into kind of galvanizing a bigger, bolder commitment from the state to housing? And I understand there's a lot of trepidation about kind of the house, and I appreciate that. But if we never ask for anything, we never get anything. So that's why I think you're starting to see in other states more and more attempts to kind of put together bigger, more multi-sector campaigns involving residents that are making bigger investments in housing, whatever that looks like.
Any last questions? Comments?
Under an hour. Good job. Work.
Well, with that,
thank you, Elizabeth.
yeah, thank you. I say that, we heard our last proposal. We did it. I say yes. Bye to as a reminder, videos, if we have them, unfortunately, the first meeting was not recorded, or we ended it too early and it didn't get recorded, but the last two have been.
Hopefully.
We're not gonna touch anything. Okay, so they will be emailed out. The survey will go out, believe it or not, this Friday. With the.
Nobody emailed Christina and I with any questions.
No. And then we would like to get, your response to the survey back by the 9th. So go out this Friday and then do the following Friday. But more information will be in that body of email and expected Friday. And we're meeting next Tuesday. Coffee team is meeting.
We're not.
Oh, wait, it's election day. No.
We're not.
No.
But then you should cancel it. Yes. We don't send out calendar invites, so please cancel it. We're not meeting next week.
I think that's an ongoing one. Yeah.
We will be meeting the following Tuesday and Thursday.
Yep, so the 13th and the 15th at NCP.
What time did we put down? I wrote 1 to 3.
Hey, I'm ending the meeting and I want to make sure I do it right.
I don't think it's set on.
So I hit end meeting, right? And then is there going to be an option? Not yet?
That meeting we have on, what I have, I think the 1 to 2:30 date is